Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 true terrifying experiences shared by cemetery caretakers, we step through the rusted gates of graveyards where names are carved in stone. Flowers wither overnight and the earth itself remembers what we try to forget. These are chilling accounts of bells that toll without wind, whispers leaking from cracked mausoleums, and footsteps echoing across gravel paths when you know you are utterly alone. This is a new channel, and my goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers watch and leave without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Subscribe now. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there is a cemetery in your town that unsettles you, type its name. Because once you step past the gates of these haunted resting grounds, not everything allows you to leave. Kill the lights, silence the world, take a slow breath, and let us begin. I didn't plan on writing this tonight, but the weather pushed me back into the old habit of staying up, making tea I don't drink, and staring at the street outside like it's going to answer something I'm too tired to ask. This is about a job I took last winter in London, when I was trying not to think about anything for more than an hour at a time. My friend Maya said I needed structure, so she put me in touch with her uncle, a quiet man called Mr. Ellis, who worked at Highgate Cemetery. He's basically the last person on earth who knows the old parts like the back of his hand, she told me. You'll just be helping him tidy, inventory some lamps, that sort of thing. London was wet and wind-bitten when I took the bus up the hill for my first day. That's what I remember most, the wind rattling dead ivy on the railings, and my breath fogging before I even reached the north gate. Highgate is beautiful in a way that doesn't feel meant for the living. The paths snake through yew and laurel, and the stones have that bleached look of names that lasted longer than the faces who spoke them. Mr. Ellis met me near the caretakers' shed, keys jangling. A small man with a jacket too big for his shoulders and a cap that looked older than both of us combined. He had one permanent squint like the sun had lived in his eyes too long and left a mark. "Ben," he said, shaking my hand like a bird landing on a branch, quick and light. "You're the friend of Maya." I said yes, and he gave a single, slow nod. "You'll do." He gave me 2 things that day, a ring of keys and a story he didn't quite mean to tell. The keys were practical. They fit every padlock and narrow gate we needed. The story came sideways a couple weeks in, when freezing rain made the paths shine and we ducked into the shed for shelter. He had a kettle on a camping stove and a box of tea bags crushed flat in the corner of his jacket. "You'll hear it from someone else if not me," he said, like I'd asked. I hadn't. People come at night sometimes, locals or students. They talk, they ask me if I've seen him. I asked who. He stared at the window, which was so fogged with our breath it looked like someone had smeared chalk across it. "The lantern keeper," he said. "People say an old man lights the lamps on the oldest row when the weather turns, when it shouldn't be possible. The gas is shut off and the tanks are empty, but on certain nights the light comes." I laughed a little because some part of me lives on the edge of a joke, and I regretted it immediately. He didn't. "You can laugh. I don't mind. Gas lamps do strange things in the cold, air in the lines, pressure you don't expect, but it's not the lamps that bother me." He poured the tea, no sugar. His hands shook a little, and a couple drops hit the camping stove and hissed. It's the way he stands, like he's at work, not haunting for the sake of it, tending. The days softened and then hardened again. London winter does that. I settled into a routine. I'd meet Mr. Ellis at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, depending on his schedule. We'd check locks, clear, windfall branches, straighten the flowers locals brought, and when the light sank low, head to the oldest row where the Victorian gas lamps stand like sentries forgotten by the army that put them there. Most are relics. They were converted to run off small reserve tanks that could be filled on special occasions, and even those we didn't use. They're ornaments now. We kept the glass clean because people like to see themselves reflected in history. A handful still had their mantles intact. "Don't put your fingers on the glass," Ellis would say, voice soft like we were in a library. "It leaves oils. Oils leave marks. Marks make cracks." That was the kind of detail he lived for. He had a name for every narrow path, bramble walk, cinder bend, the steps of misery, and a habit of humming an old tune under his breath when he worked. I tried to catch the melody, but it always slipped away. Maya came up one Saturday with thermoses and impatient questions. She and I had known each other since we were kids, back when the scariest thing we did was sneak into each other's back gardens after midnight. She wore a red scarf that made her look like a single bright thing in all that gray. "You look better," she said, and meant I looked less haunted. I nodded and changed the subject. We walked the older row together, the three of us. Mr. Ellis showed us a little register he kept in a plastic folder, hand-drawn maps, notes of who was buried near which angel with the broken wing. Maya asked him about the lantern keeper, because of course she did. Ellis cleared his throat and said he'd never seen the man himself and that it was probably kids. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. Under the umbrella of her look was the real question. Had I seen anything? I hadn't. I didn't even believe I was the sort of person who could. The next week it rained in sheets, the sort of rain that feels like it's hurting you on purpose. I was almost relieved because bad weather made the inside work seem warmer. Ellis told me to go through the old storage drawers in the shed and make a list of anything we might actually need. I found things that felt like props from a play, thickly woven lamp wicks, brittle mantles that crumbled when you breathed, a box of brass spanners, and a ledger with a cracked leather cover the exact color of tea. It was full of names written in beautiful, patient script. Most of the entries were from the 19th century. I assumed it was a reproduction until the ink flared when the light hit it, and I realized the paper had that faint, sweet smell books get when they've outlived a generation. I read entries at random and found the same tidy signature at the end of almost every week. J. Mallory Keeper? It wasn't a romantic title. He was the man who kept the lamps in order. I didn't think any more of it than that until Ellis returned with rain on his collar and glanced down at the ledger. His mouth tightened. "Put that away," he said, not unkind. "We don't need old ghosts." I could have let it go. I didn't. The ledger lodged in my head the way a note gets stuck in a song and won't stop replaying, even when you tell yourself to think of anything else. I started looking for that name around the cemetery, almost idly, like when your eyes snag on a word you think you've seen before. It popped up in tiny places, scratched in pencil on the back of a maintenance card from 1890, stamped on a receipt for lamp oil, tucked into a line in a letter someone had photocopied for the archives. Mallory reports breakage on the eastwardmost lamp, recommends replacement. It gave the old row weight. Someone had cared enough to list every fault and fix. Someone who had stood there on nights when the wind cut like glass and adjusted a flame with 2 fingers. That was Thursday's thought when I locked up on Dawai. Friday I took the late shift because Ellis had a doctor's appointment. He came back just as the sky went from steel to charcoal and asked if I minded sweeping the steps by the catacombs before I left. I said sure and meant it. The work made me feel like I was paying rent to the city. The stone drank the last of the light. I'd just picked up my bag when I noticed it. At first I thought a car on Swain's Lane had turned and thrown its headlamps across the trees. But the light didn't move like that, and there was no sound of tires on wet road. It was warmer than a headlight. Yellow, like butter melting. I stood in the doorway of the shed and watched until my brain caught up with my eyes and told me what it might be. A lamp. I turned off my torch because I didn't want to confuse what I was looking at and stepped out under the yews. The rain had eased to a spit carried sideways by wind. You know how when your ears fill with wind you feel like the whole world has gone quiet because you can't hear your own shoes? It was like that. The light drew me like the smell of toast from another room. I cut across the mossy path, the dark slick and soft under my boots, and came up behind the oldest row. One lamp burned. Just one. I don't know what I expected. Fire is practical more than magical when it's small and contained. The glass was clean because I'd cleaned it, and through it I saw the mantle bloom. It looked like a little cloud caught in a cage, edges ragged and bright. The brass pipe at the base was intact. The tank it should have been fed from was empty. I knew because I'd opened it that morning and felt the hollow, felt my breath go in and out as if the tank had lungs and borrowed mine. I circled it and put my hand near the glass without touching. Heat. Real heat. I whispered Mr. Ellis's name like a test. No answer. The path bent back toward the west side where the ground rises, so I took it. The old route continues along the ridge. Lamps posted at even distances that once mapped the rhythm of evenings and now only hinted at it. As I rounded the bend, I saw another glow. Not the buttery breast of a single flame, but a chain of them. The next 4 lamps were lit. Then as I watched the 5th, it didn't flare all at once. It nursed itself to life. A thin string of light shivering, then thickening, then settling like a bird fluffed against the cold. I didn't think ghost. I thought trespasser. I went faster, then slower, then stopped because I could hear something that wasn't the wind. It was small and precise, the click of metal on metal. The sound of a lamp key turning. The breathing I thought was mine matched me, then didn't. Someone was ahead of me, moving from post to post. I called, "Hello, sir?" Because you say sir when you don't want to start a fight with someone you can't see. The sound went still. The air went very clean, like the first mouthful after a storm clears. The lamps burned steadily. I took another step. The rain let up. Then I saw him. He stood by the 6th lamp with his back to me. He wore a long dark coat with a high collar, and a hat that would have looked like a joke on anyone else, but on him it looked like a uniform. The brim was short, and the crown had a dent in the top that caught a flash when the lamp sighed. He held a small tool in his right hand, a long narrow key with the teeth turned sideways. His left hand was steadying the lamp's access door. He wasn't translucent. He wasn't blue. He looked solid in the way people look solid when you aren't expecting them, and your brain can't find the actor to play them. "Sir," I said again, closer this time, and he turned. I've tried to think of a way to describe his face that doesn't make me sound like I've watched too many low-budget films. All I can say is that faces are clocks, and sometimes you can tell what time they stopped. His skin had the texture of paper that's been kept too dry. His eyes were very dark and very alive. I saw curiosity there, not hate or love. The curiosity of someone checking if a door is really locked. He tipped his hat to me with 2 fingers, old-fashioned and efficient, and the gesture made my scalp crawl. The key in his hand flashed again. The lamps behind him hummed. "We're closed," I said, because my mouth fell back on something it knew how to say. Something I'd said to teenagers and tourists. "I'll have to ask you to make your way to the gate." He glanced down at the base of the lamp as if he'd dropped a thought there and needed to pick it up. "No gates where work is to be done," he said. His voice was like a jacket found in a trunk, dry and shaped by another body, another time. Work is the gate. He reached into his coat with his free hand and took out a small leather pouch that I knew without knowing was full of mantles. He handled one with care and swapped it, even though the existing one glowed fine. When he touched the lamp, I smelled gas like a memory. It wasn't the big punch of an open valve. It was the faint, sweet, stinging scent of something that doesn't belong to the air. "There's no fuel," I said, which was a stupid thing to say. It was like telling someone that water is wet while they're swimming. He gave me a look that made me understand I'd mistaken the function of reality in the presence of whatever he was. "There's always fuel," he said mildly. "The nights do not go out." He moved to the next lamp with a quick practice step, as if his hands knew distances better than his feet. I followed because stopping felt like a worse decision than going on. I said his name because the ledger had planted it there and I wanted it to bloom. "Mr. Mallory?" He paused a fraction, so small I might be inventing it now, and turned his head just enough to show me his profile. The left side of his face was a little more collapsed than the right, like time had pressed down harder there. "I am that," he said, and then, as if answering a thought I hadn't yet had, "and not." I wanted to run. I didn't because Mr. Ellis was somewhere behind us on the paths, and because running would mean turning my back on the lamps, and because the work of fear is often smaller than the idea of it. I looked down at my hands and they were doing their own thing, flexing and straightening like they were preparing to lift something. He moved again. I kept pace. We didn't speak for 3 lamps. The sound of the key on the door, the little breath the flame took when it woke, the tiny ping when the glass adjusted to the heat. Those were the words we made. At the 9th lamp, I found mine. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, and hated how it sounded like a child invoking a rule he didn't understand. "Neither are you," he said, and I felt my mouth dry out. "But we make do." He bent to the base and I saw his hands properly for the first time. They were not skeleton hands or burning hands or the hands of a corpse, whatever that is. They were hands that worked. I saw a pale scar under the knuckle of the thumb. I saw a little ground-in soot like you get from cleaning a barbecue. I saw the coil of a vein that would have rolled under a doctor's finger once. On impulse, I reached out. I meant to touch the brass, not him. The cold had made everything ache, and warmth has a gravity that's hard to fight. My fingers brushed the edge of the access panel and slipped. Skin touched skin. I expected my hand to pass through or to freeze or to be burned. None of that happened. His skin felt like paper, but paper that had been warmed by a radiator. Some half-imagined house heat from a time before central heating meant anything. I yanked back and he looked up, and in that look I felt a rush of something that wasn't anger but recognition. Like he'd been listening for a noise and finally heard it again. "You keep them," he said softly. "Even now." "That's right." I didn't understand until he tilted his head toward the glow and added almost to himself, "What we tend tends us." I would have laughed, but my throat wouldn't let me. My breath felt like a coin turning on its edge. He started down the last slope of the row and the lamps before us were dark. The lamps behind us a constellation pinned to the path. We came to the very oldest. Its glass was more pitted, the frame pitted with age. He opened it with a careful ritual and for the first time didn't touch the mantle. He set the key on top of the housing and stood back waiting. The wind had been steady. It dropped. I heard the tiny click from inside the lamp house like a tongue unsticking from the roof of a mouth. The mantle glowed. I thought of candles and the way a room feels different with one burning, even if it doesn't change the temperature. The world nudged itself into a little better focus. Then I heard footsteps behind me and turned, heart hammering. Mr. Ellis came into view, walking fast, coat flapping, cap pulled low. He saw me, saw the lamps, saw the man at the end of the row. The expression that crossed his face wasn't surprise. It was grief. He said no, very quietly, like he'd promised himself he wouldn't. Mallory turned toward us and folded his hands, courteous as a host. Ellis was breathing hard, the way small men do when their bodies have learned to spend every breath carefully. "You can't keep doing this," he told the figure at the lamp. "It's done." "It's been done. Who says?" Mallory asked, genuinely interested. "Someone with a key," Ellis said, and his hand went to his own ring, the one he'd given me a smaller copy of. It sounded like nonsense, but it wasn't. Doors are what make places. Places are what make work. The wind moved through the U like a dress being taken off. Maya, who must have sensed the pull of my recklessness or had simply decided to check on us, arrived then, small and quick. Her red scarf a flag in that long, dark corridor of trees. She took in the scene in the time it takes to think a thought and squeezed my arm once. "Ben," she said softly, and the sound of my name brought me back into my body. I whispered, "It's him," and immediately felt stupid because who was he in words that made sense? "We should leave," she said, not unkind, not unbrave. Mallory watched this like a man at a window watching two birds decide which fence to land on. He put on his hat again, so precise, like the gesture had meaning beyond keeping his head dry. "I will keep the line," he said. As I did. As I do. "You were buried here," Ellis said, and his voice cracked. He took a step closer, then stopped as if he'd hit a line on the ground we couldn't see. "You have a place. You've been seen. You've been cared for. It's not your work now." Mallory's expression went very gentle. "Who saved my wife's hands from the cold?" he asked, not looking at any of us. His voice turned slightly upward like he was directing it to a year and not a person. "Who kept the fog from the steps?" He looked at Ellis. "Who kept the night from spilling?" "We keep it," Ellis whispered. "We do." "I do." Mallory nodded, satisfied, then looked back at the lamp and gently opened the access door again. The flame bowed and then resumed. Maya's fingers on my sleeve tightened. "Ben," she said again, but my name felt far away, like a boat you can still see but not reach. I don't know if he thought we might try to stop him. I don't think we could have. He lit the last lamp with a slight tilt of his head like a question. When it burned, he stepped back and looked along the row with an inspector's pride. The light created a pathway that had not existed a minute before. It made sense of the dark. He took a breath, or he made the sound of someone taking a breath. Then he looked down at his hand where I had touched him, flexed his fingers as if remembering their shape, and pressed the lamp key into my palm. It felt heavier than it had any right to. "You keep them," he said. "Even now." The weight of the metal warmed my skin. I looked at Ellis for help. His face had sunk into a sadness I didn't know how to touch. "Mr. Mallory," he said sadly, almost fondly, so quiet we might have all imagined it. "John, your rest." There is a way a person can turn that no actor can fake. A loosening around the mouth, a softening at the lid of the eye. Mallory had that briefly. He inclined his head to Ellis, to me, to Maya, who stood as still as stone, and then he walked past us. Not melodramatically, not through us or above us. Past us with the small care of a man not wanting to brush a stranger's coat. He moved along the path, and as he passed each lamp it dimmed slightly, as if acknowledging but not extinguishing itself. At the bend he stopped. He took off his hat and held it in both hands for a second, some private gesture that didn't include us, then put it back on and walked into the shadow of the U. The lamp stayed lit. We stood there a long time until the cold made my skin feel too tight and my fingertips ached around the key. Ellis let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it since the ledger was last opened. "It's worse on nights with wind," he said, eyes on the last place we'd seen Mallory. "And on anniversaries." "He likes anniversaries," he turned to me. "Give me the key," he said, and I handed it over without thinking. He wrapped it in his handkerchief and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. We walked back the long way. We didn't talk the whole time. On the lane the world felt wrong, normal. We locked up and Ellis said, "You did well," like I'd passed a test I hadn't studied for. I went home on a bus that was almost empty and watched the city smear past. I slept badly and woke before dawn to the old nervous habit of making tea I don't drink. The key stayed in my head. Late that morning I went back. I don't know why. It felt like something had been started and it would be cowardly not to put a period on it. The day was hard, bright, and cold. I used my own copy to let myself in and walked to the old row. The lamps were dark, obviously. That should have been enough. I stood there anyway, breathing clouds, studying the metal skins of the lamps like they might show me what had happened. On impulse, I tried the access panel on the last lamp. It opened easily, like it had been waiting. Inside, wrapped in a clean piece of cloth that smelled of old paper, was the key. The same key, or an older twin. The cloth was marked in beautiful ink. If not for tonight, then for another. It wasn't a note you leave for a vandal or a tourist. It was a memo you leave yourself when you know your shifts will outlast your body. I rewrapped it, and I swear I turned to find Mr. Ellis there, only to realize I was reacting to an absence. The path was empty, but I could hear humming. The tune he never finished. I told myself the sound was in my head and closed the lamp with my thumbs pressed hard against the metal until warmth soaked into me. When I got back to the shed, Ellis was there, shoulders hunched, writing in his own book with a pencil almost too short to hold. He looked up. I wanted to tell him about the key, but he spoke first. "Don't take it," he said. "It's not for taking." I said I hadn't. He nodded like I'd done him a kindness. He told me to go home early. I did. I saw Maya that night, and we avoided the subject for an hour before she asked if I was okay. I said yes, and then no, and then yes. She put her hand over mine where it sat on my glass and said, "I'm glad you saw it. I'm sorry you did." The winter ground its teeth and moved on. Mr. Ellis missed a few days, then more. I helped another groundskeeper, a younger man who liked football and kept his hat in his pocket instead of on his head. The cemetery felt different with him not humming along the paths. The lamps didn't light again in front of me, but once walking up Swain's Lane on a night the wind had a knife in it, I looked through the railings and saw the faintest blush along the old row. Not enough to call light exactly, more the promise of it. I didn't go in. I kept walking, and my breath moved in front of me like I was pulling something on a string. In February, I found the ledger in the drawer again when I wasn't looking for it. I opened it to a page I'd swear I hadn't left marked and found a final entry that didn't look like the others. The writing was uncertain, as if the hand had learned the style from practice or memory. The date was smudged. The signature was clear. J. Mallory, Keeper. I closed the book. I don't know what to do with any of it except tell it. And I don't know if telling helps. If you're asking me what I believe, I can't give you two clean lines. I believe in work. I believe in keys. I believe in people who stay the shape of themselves longer than seems fair. Sometimes I think I see a glow through the slick black branches when a storm kicks up. And in that glow is a man checking a flame that needs to be exactly its size and not a hair bigger. Sometimes I think I only see my own breath. The key should be with Mr. Ellis. That's where I leave things in my head because it's kinder. But some nights when the kettle is gurgling and I've lost the taste for tea again, I feel weight in my coat that wasn't there before. I put my hand in and pull out nothing. My palm smells faintly, impossibly like gas. I wash my hands. I dry them. It lingers. And if the wind is mean enough and the rain falls sharp enough to draw blood from stone, I can hear someone in the distance humming a tune without an end, checking lamps on a row that had its light taken away and found a way to burn anyway. If you pass Highgate on a night like that and see a warmth where there shouldn't be any, don't climb the railings. Don't chase it. You'll only find what you bring. And if the glow moves ahead of you and waits like a patient thing with a job to do, don't make the mistake of thinking it's for you. It's for the night. It always was. I wasn't planning to post this, but the apartment across from mine put up a Christmas garland in October. And when the wind moved it, the little silver bells made a sound that turned my stomach. It wasn't the sound itself. It was the way it came through the glass, muffled and low, like something calling up from under a floor. I closed the window and told myself I was being ridiculous. Then I saw the cemetery wall beyond the building, the dark line of trees and the cobbled lanes of Père Lachaise lifting toward the sky like frozen waves. And I figured I'd write it down while I still can sleep. I moved to Paris 2 years ago and ended up renting a tiny studio on a street that runs along the southern edge of the cemetery. If you stand on my balcony, you can see the backs of family tombs and the lamp at the Porte Gambetta entrance. It's quieter than you'd think. Most nights, the loudest thing is the bus brakes and the faint clink of bottles when the cafe on the corner closes. I liked walking there during the day, when it felt like a museum that forgot it was outdoors. Names cut into stone, little oval photographs under cracked glass, tiny doors with rusted keyholes. Tourists cluster around the famous graves, but if you keep walking, the lanes get narrow and the trees knit together overhead. It smells like damp leaves and old marble. It's strangely comforting, or it was. The first time I heard the bells, it was past midnight in January. I was on the phone with my sister back home, doing that half-listening thing where you stare at the microwave clock. It read 12:17. The building and the street were quiet. Then, clear as if someone were just outside, I heard a bell. Not a church bell rolling out over rooftops. It was lower, woolly at the edges, as if the sound had to push through a blanket of dirt. One toll, then another. I muted my sister and walked to the window. The cemetery was a darker darkness beyond the wall. The bell sounded again, irregular, not a peal, more like whoever was ringing wasn't sure of the rhythm. "Sorry," I told my sister. "I thought I heard something." "Paris ghosts," she said. "She thinks everything is charming." When we hung up, I stood there for a while. The bells went on maybe a minute and then stopped. I didn't think about it much the next morning. The wind moves things. Metal clanks. City noises make their way through cracks. But that night at 12:17 again, I heard the bells. Then the next. After a week, I stopped telling myself it was pipes and started listening. If I pressed my ear to the cold window pane, I could feel a faint tremor, like the smallest version of a subway passing underfoot. I mentioned it to Camille, who sits across from me at work and who grew up in the 20th. "Bells," she said, amused. "From where?" "There's no church over there. Unless the dead are having mass." "I'm serious," I said. "It's like they're underground." Her face changed in that tiny way that lets you know someone knows a story and was waiting for permission to tell it. "My grandfather was a caretaker there after the war," she said. "He used to say he heard bells under the old mausoleums on certain nights. He told my mother once that there were families who installed safety bells during cholera, with little strings in the coffins. You know, in case someone wasn't actually dead. They say that's where Saved by the Bell comes from. But I think that's just something people like to say." "They put a bell in the coffin?" "A little one, on a cord tied to the wrist. If the caretaker heard it, he would go open the tomb." She made a face. "He never did. He only heard them far away at night when he was closing for the day and everyone had gone. My mother said he drank after that." I Googled later and found enough references to safety coffins to feel stupid for doubting the idea. But it was also obvious that whatever had been used then wasn't going to be audible now through stone and soil. Especially not all the way to my window through a wall and a line of trees. I didn't really worry until the bells started changing. After 2 weeks of the same minute, the time shifted to 12:19, then 12:21. Some nights it was 12:17 again. And some nights, in the seconds before they began, The lights in the hallway flickered the way they do when the elevator moves, even though ours shuts off at night. I told myself it was electricity. A city is just a net of wires buzzing, right? On a damp Monday, I stayed late at work and walked home along the wall instead of taking the bus. The cemetery gates had closed at 6, but you can look through. The lamps inside make little yellow circles on the cobbles, and the bronze angels catch the light like they've been polished. A man in a navy coat with a caretaker's badge was locking a side door, the kind of discreet service entrance you don't notice until you see someone going through it. He had a tired, watchful face. I don't know what made me speak to him. Maybe the way he looked like he had spent his whole life being quiet around fragile things. Bonsoir, I said in my careful French. Do you ever hear bells? At night, he straightened. What kind of bells? Like bells underground? He smiled a little then, in the way of someone who's heard a joke and is acting as if it's new. Sometimes the pipes bang, he said. Sometimes wind catches metal. The dead here are quiet. I live right there, I pointed to my building. They always ring at night. Around midnight. He glanced past me at the wall. You should keep your windows closed in winter, he said. The damp gets in. Okay, I said, feeling stupid. As he turned away, he said without looking back, if you ever hear them more than 12 times, go inside. At 12:22 that night, the bells rang 13 times. I counted. I counted out loud. I didn't move until my chest hurt. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed on the balcony, if anything. Probably nothing. But the fact that he had said it like a recipe made me feel like there were steps I had to follow to stay safe. I saw him again on Wednesday. He was sweeping wet leaves from a step near the wall. I counted, I said. 13. He looked up at me properly this time, as if examining me for the first time. You are not from here, he said, which people say a lot when you're obviously speaking their language like a careful tourist. I'm from Georgia, I said, as if that made any difference. Etienne, he said, touching his badge. My grandwonkel used to keep keys for this side. He talked too much about things that do not like to be spoken of. Now I keep keys and I do not speak. You told me to go inside. Sometimes we listen to old mistakes, he said. He meant the safety bells, I think, and something else I didn't have words for. Camille made fun of me at lunch. You're in love with a cemetery guard, she said. This is how bad Paris romances begin, with a broom and a warning. Then she asked me to come out on Friday for her boyfriend's birthday at a wine bar near Ménilmontant. I said yes and meant it. I wanted noise. I wanted a crowd to rub out the shape the bells were making in my evenings. I told myself it was just a sound. That's all any haunting is in the beginning, a sound you can't put away. On Friday, I forgot to charge my phone at work and it died at the bar. When I left just after midnight, the buses were sparse, so I walked down the hill. The lamps made little cones of light on the wet pavement. My breath fogged. Somewhere a scooter rattled. The world had that post-midnight hum like a refrigerator. When I turned onto my street, I stopped. The bells were already ringing, not behind the wall, but to my right, down the slope, where the cemetery meets a little square and a convenience store with a flickering neon sign. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt close because it was coming up through the stone at my feet. There was someone else on the sidewalk, a young guy with a backpack and headphones hanging around his neck. He froze too. We looked at each other, embarrassed but also relieved not to be the only one. He said in French, "Don't you hear that?" Yeah, his eyes were wide. It's under us. A door across the street opened and Madame Rousseau, who lives on the second floor of my building and waters her geraniums year-round, stuck her head out. She heard it too, because she crossed herself and shut the door without saying anything. The bells kept tolling, each one a little different in length, like whoever was making them didn't have a script. I don't know why I did what I did next. I think it was the way the sound seemed to slide toward the corner, to a metal drain in the curb where rainwater runs down into the old Paris catacombs drains. Not the ossuary ones tourists visit, but the veins that carry stormwater away. I crossed the street and crouched by the drain. The grate was wet and gritty. The sound was definitely below it. My rational mind tried to stand up and go home. My other mind, the one that pays attention to pattern, reached into my pocket and found the little flashlight on my keychain. The beam caught water moving lazily over stone and something like a string pinned under a pebble. The bells tolled again. For a second I thought I saw it move. Don't put your hand in there, the young man said. There are rats. Good point, I said. I stood and walked fast along the wall until I reached the service door where I'd seen Etienne. I banged on it, nothing. I was about to walk away when I heard the inner latch slide. He opened it just enough for his face. "You hear it?" I said. He listened. The bells were still going. His mouth thinned. "Where?" "The street," I said. "The drain." He opened the door all the way then and came out with a ring of keys and a small black canvas bag. "You," he said to the young man who had followed out of sheer curiosity, "you can go home." The kid nodded gratefully and did. Etienne locked the service door and led me along the inside path parallel to the wall. It felt illegal to be in there at night, and I suppose it was, but his keys turned with the confidence of someone who could write his own rules. The lanes inside are different after dark. They hold on to the light and throw back the rest. Our footsteps sounded too loud on the cobbles. When the bells tolled again, I felt it under my feet, which is a stupid thing to say, but there it is. He unlatched a low iron gate around a family plot and set his bag down on the little marble step as if he had done this before in daylight. Inside the bag were a pry bar, a small shovel, a coil of nylon rope, and a flashlight like a policeman's. He clicked it on and examined the seams around a slab that had shifted a little from the winter heaving. "This should not be open," he said, as if to himself. He put the pry bar into a crack and leaned his weight on it. The slab shifted with a sucking sound like a jar breaking its seal. Cold air from below rose around us, and with it the clear sound of bells. Louder than before, but still dulled, as if the sound ate the air it moved through. "I thought you said the dead were quiet," I said, trying to make my voice light. "I lied," he said. The way the light fell, he looked older, like his face had been folded long ago and then ironed back out. He looped the rope around a rusted ring set into the slab and handed the free end to me. "Pull when I tell you." We shifted it enough that a dark hole opened to a short set of stone steps. There was a smell like damp cloth. He went first, holding the flashlight underhand to blunt the glare. I followed because I didn't know how not to. The bells were close enough now that my ribs felt them. The steps dropped to a low vaulted room, not much larger than a one-car garage. The walls were brick. There were niches in the walls that had once held urns, but they were empty. The floor was smooth and wet. On the far wall, hung on iron brackets, were 3 bells. They were the size of those you see in a small chapel or a schoolhouse. They were bronze, but the bronze was black with age. There were no ropes. They were swinging, not wildly. Each one moved in small arcs, as if a steady hand had set them in motion and kept nudging. The clappers touched metal with that dull, covered sound. They should have been loud enough to hurt our ears in that small space. But they weren't. The sound seemed to compress into itself, concentrated and far away at the same time. On the wall beneath them, cut into the brick and chalk to brighten the letters, were names. The newest ones were pale, chalk caught in fresh tool marks. Each name had a date. All the dates were today. One of the names was the boy with the backpack. I knew because he'd told the cashier at the convenience store his name when he bought cigarettes, and the cashier corrected his pronunciation of something, and they laughed. I had paid attention because his French was as careful as mine. The date under his name was today. The bell tolled again. In the corner of the room where the water gathered and ran into a little drain, the flow thickened for a second, a little clot of leaves or paper, and then it was gone. I took a step back and hit the wall. I couldn't make my mouth move. Etienne lifted the flashlight so the beam blew dust from the far corners. On the opposite wall, faint with age, were other names. Some crossed out. Some with 2 dates, one that had been chiseled, one added later in chalk in a different hand. "Sometimes they ring for a long time before," he said. His voice wasn't dramatic. He was telling me traffic directions. When a name appears, it is not always immediate, but it is soon. The bells tell. We do not like to listen. "How do the names get there?" I asked, because that was easier than asking anything else. "They are carved," he said, and for a stupid second I wondered who came down with a chisel at night. Then he pointed at the lowest line. There was a space after the last chalked name. Tiny white dust lay on the floor under it, and the chalk on the ledge had a smear, as if someone with damp fingers had tested it and then set it down. "I don't understand," I said. And I did, and I hated that I did. He moved the beam to the bells. They swung on invisible impulses, gliding through arcs as neat as pendulums. Above them, the curve of the vault was soot-stained, as if candles had burned there for years. We had them walled up, he said. Before my time. Someone takes down what we put up. Not a person. Some nights the bricks are on the floor. Some mornings the names have appeared on the inner wall, but there is no dust. So we think they were written somewhere else and then brought here. Then we tell ourselves stories. That is what keeps a city standing. Stories that explain the things in the basements. It's not funny, I said, because my brain still thinks humor is a kind of exit. No, he said, it is not. We stood like that for I don't know how long. The bells slowed. The chalk dust settled like snow. He touched my sleeve finally and tilted his head toward the stairs. It's better if we come back when there is light. What about the names? They will be there or they won't, he said. We do not make the order. We pulled the slab back in place. The street looked ordinary and ugly when we came out, which was a relief. My keys were cold in my hand. I didn't sleep. I sat at the table and drank water and watched the microwave clock skip through its blue numbers. At 3:03 I heard sirens down by the square. I told myself they were about a fight in the bar that stays open too late. In the morning, Camille texted a link to a local news blurb about a tragic accident involving a pedestrian near Père Lachaise, and then a minute later, "You okay?" I said yes, because technically in that minute I was. I went to the corner store for milk. The cashier, who is always kind to my French, was telling a neighbor that a kid had stepped off the curb with his headphones on. He was nice, the cashier said. He always counted his change twice. He looked at me and I looked away. Above the cereal boxes, someone had pinned a flyer about a missing cat, the kind with tear-off phone numbers at the bottom. All the little numbers were still there. No one had torn them off yet. I didn't see Etienne that day or the next. I walked the lanes inside with the tourists and tried to find the plot again, but I couldn't, because the place is a labyrinth designed by grief. All the doors looked like the one with the ring. All the angels looked like they were listening. I went home when it began to rain and sat at my little table and told myself I would sleep early. I didn't. At 12:11 the hallway lights flickered. At 12:17 the bells began. I counted to 12 and went to the balcony. The street was empty. A taxi slid by with its light on. The bells kept going, 13, 14, 15. I closed the window and leaned my forehead against the frame. The cold went straight through. When I turned around, there was white dust on my floor under the wall where it meets the kitchen counter. My building is old. Plaster falls. That is a reasonable sentence to say out loud. My hands shook anyway. I went to the bathroom and turned on the shower to make steam and noise and then turned it off again, because the sound of water in the drain made me feel like I was cracking. In the morning, I bought a small, battery-powered radio to play news at night so there would always be talking to hold the shape of the air. I kept it low enough not to bother Madame Rousseau. The next night, the bells came through it like water does through cloth. You can make a thing thin, but you can't make it empty without tearing it. On the third day, I found Etienne by the gate with a thermos and a paper bag. He looked tired in a new way. "You came back," I said. "I live here," he said, with no heat. Then he sighed. "We should not have gone down. Sometimes when you look, the looking looks back. That is a thing we teach the new ones." "I can move," I said, surprising myself. "I can leave the street." "You can," he said. "Do you think sound cannot follow? It is a city. Everything echoes. It is only a question of where you hear it first." He took a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something, then tore out the page and handed it to me. It was a phone number, and under it, a name that wasn't his. "If there is a name on the wall that you know, call this woman. She helps with the paperwork. She knows everyone. It does not change the thing. But sometimes it lets the family make calls before the police." "That's horrible," I said, which was not what I meant. I meant thank you and also why. He put the notebook away. "Do not go down again," he said. "Do not bring anyone. Do not talk about it at night." "I'm talking now," I said. "It's not night," he said. "The walls are thicker in the day." I tried to do normal things. I went to work and pretended not to look at every clock. I nodded at Camille's stories about the birthday after I left. I bought vegetables. I said bonjour to the old man who sweeps cigarette butts into the gutter with his bendy broom. The bells still found me. If I kept the radio on loud enough to cover them, I could feel them, humming under the floor like someone had left a washing machine running 2 rooms away. If I turned it off, they sounded like what they were, bells with no ropes moving in a dark room. On Sunday afternoon, I went back into the cemetery with a book and sat on a bench, with a view of the city's roofs. Families went by, dragging kids who wanted to see Jim Morrison or someone else from the map. The crows were loud. A girl in a red coat practiced walking on a low wall, balancing with her arms out like a tightrope walker. Her mother stood near the path and did the universal mom thing of pretending to be on her phone while being ready to catch her. For an hour, I almost forgot that the night existed. Then I noticed chalk on the bench. A little smear like a letter started and rubbed out. That's nothing, I told myself. Children draw on everything. But I moved anyway. I stood under a tree and tried to remember what it was like to be in a place without an extra sound in it. At 6 o'clock, the guards started to ask everyone to head for the gates. A line of people formed at the Porte Gambetta. I saw Etienne at the back, locking the little service door. He caught my eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if I had just suggested a bad idea aloud. I nodded as if I understood the message I hadn't said. Then I went home. I'm writing this now because last night after the bells, after the hallway lights flickered and the radio hissed and the geraniums knocked softly on their hooks, I checked the wall by my kitchen and found fresh chalk dust again. I got down on my knees and slid the trash can aside. There was a mark on the skirting board where the plaster meets the wood, a tiny white curve like the beginning of a letter. It could be the scrape of a chair leg. It could be anything. I watched it until my eyes watered and it did not move. I told myself I was tired. I slept for 2 hours and woke at 4:13 from a dream that was only a sound. The sound of metal touched by a gloved hand. This morning I called the number he gave me and it went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? How does a person tell a stranger that the walls are writing? When I went out for coffee, I saw a city worker prying up the grate where I had crouched that Friday night. He had a fluorescent vest and a cigarette in his mouth. He looked like someone who could fix anything that had a bolt on it. I stood far enough away not to draw attention. He lifted the grate and propped it with a metal bar and lowered a light on a cord. Another worker peered in. They talked about a blockage. They said fatberg, which is a word I wish I didn't know now. They laughed the way men laugh when they have to put their hands somewhere dark. The light swung and caught something that wasn't a stone and wasn't a leaf. For a second it looked like a knot of cords. Then the light moved and it was just water again. The worker stubbed his cigarette on the curb and went back to the truck for a tool I didn't know the name of. I went upstairs and shut the window and set the radio on the sill like a talisman. It's almost midnight now. I can hear the bar crowd thining out, the one drunk who argues with gravity at the corner. I'm not going to listen tonight, I tell myself. But there's a kind of listening that happens even when you're loud. The clock is going to move to 12:17 whether I look at it or not. I keep thinking of Etienne saying sometimes the names appear somewhere else and are brought there, and how matter-of-fact he was about it, and how the chalk on the bench didn't mean anything until it did. The silver garland across the street rattles when the wind changes, and I can handle that, because it's thin and bright and above ground. The other sound is never quite above or below. It's like it's coming from the city itself, folded into the layer between buildings and air. If I'm honest, I don't care if anyone believes me. I'm writing it down as a way to pin the fear in one place. If you live near here and you start to hear bells that come from the wrong direction, close your window like he said, and if they go past 12, go inside. If you love someone, don't tell them about this at night. Tell them in the morning, when the walls are thicker and the lights better and you can say the word coincidence without it sounding like a prayer. I'm going to put my phone on the table and turn the radio up to the news and the weather and the traffic reports, and I'm going to act like the world has the volume it's supposed to have. But the chalk is still under the cabinet, and the curving line is a little longer tonight, the faintest start of a letter I recognize and don't. The bells will do what they do whether I listen or not. If names get called the way they do on the wall, that dull covered toll, that sound like a hand moving something heavy inside your life, I think maybe the only control we get is deciding how much of the story we tell ourselves to make it to morning. It's 12:16, the lights just flickered. The radio made a sound like breath. I'm not going to look at the microwave. I'm not going to count. I'm not going to listen. The silver bells across the street beat gently against the glass, and somewhere under the city I can feel the air move, a slow swing swaying back to center, waiting for whatever keeps it in motion to touch it again. I've sat on this for almost a year, telling myself it was just stress and night shift brain. But it's getting difficult to sleep through a tram bell without tasting stone dust, so I'm writing it down. If you know Prague, you know how the city keeps its dead close. The cemetery I worked at isn't the famous one in Josefov with the leaning tombstones you see on postcards, but it's old enough that the paths buckle in winter, and the names on the older stones look like frost patterns. I took the job because it was steady and quiet. I was studying at night and needed a paycheck that didn't involve drunks. It was me, an older groundskeeper named Novak who liked black coffee and crossword puzzles, and my childhood friend Tomasz who could fix anything with a piece of wire and a swear. My sister Clara said only I would manage to find a job that combined my love of quiet places with my fear of phone calls. The cemetery's layout is easier to picture than to explain. 2 iron gates, 1 main and 1 for deliveries. A chapel with chipped angels riding the roof line like they're about to jump. Lines of linden trees that drop sticky seeds in summer and click against the stones in the wind. The old Jewish section is walled off on 3 sides and open toward the newer Czech graves on the 4th, like a held breath. That's where the grave in question is. It looks like dozens of others. Time-darkened sandstone, no photo, no porcelain oval, just a tall rectangular stele with a shallow arch at the top. The first time I singled it out was because I misread the name. I thought it said Ledek, but when I leaned in it was Ledek. The C had a diacritic that had been half chiseled away. The epitaph below it read in neat Czech, Nech mě zapomenout, co jsem viděl. Let me forget what I've seen. That's not a common phrase on stones here. You get beloved mother, he rests, verses about fields and rivers. The appeal of the city is that even our ghosts are practical, but I shrugged it off as some 19th century sentiment and moved on. That was late October. Nights were starting at 4. The wind had a smell like wet paper and old iron. Novak didn't like walking the old section after dark. He said it was the dogs. The neighbor on the north side had a pair of big bored shepherds that went hysterical at anything moving. Whenever I checked that way, he'd pass me the heavy ring of keys and say, "Be back before your tea goes cold, Adam." He'd sit by the space heater in the office and circle verbs in his crossword book. Tomasz would be in the workshop cleaning spark plugs with a toothbrush and telling me why my shoes were wrong for November. The first real strange thing was tiny. I wiped leaves from the Ledek stone on a Tuesday night and read the epitaph again, while pulling off slug trails with a glove. It said the same thing, but in German. Lass mich vergessen, was ich gesehen habe. The style of the letters was the same. The spacing. The shallow chips where you could tell the chisel had jumped in stone. I thought, okay, there's a Czech inscription and a German one. 2 layers like palimpsest, and I'd just not noticed. That happens. Your eyes slide over detail when you're bored. I told myself I'd bring a soft brush next time and get a closer look. I didn't mention it to anyone. The cemetery has enough politics that you keep your observations quiet unless they involve vandals or money. The next night the epitaph was in Hebrew. I don't read Hebrew, not truly, but the letters were not decorative carvings. They had that heavy, certain look of words. They were shallow like worn stone, and there was grit on the base where chiseling leaves grit. I stood there with my headlamp beam washing the letters until the battery dimmed and the cold found my wrists. I told myself some mason had carved different epitaphs at different times, and time was doing what it does. I took a photo with my phone. It came out flat. In the photo, the letters looked like any shadows on any stone. That frustrated me more than I'd like to admit. I've always been the kind of person who wants proof of the weird thing I think I see. You'd think working among the dead would beat that out of you, but it does the opposite. It makes you petty about proof. On Thursday, I asked Tomasz if we had wax in the workshop. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Beeswax? For what, your mustache?" I told him I was going to make rubbings of an inscription, and I didn't want to leave residue. He shrugged and handed me a stub of candle and a roll of thin paper we used for templates. "If you summon a rabbi, I'm not paying him," he said, which was a joke because Tomasz's mother lights candles for everyone and everything, saints he makes up on the spot included. I didn't go alone. The dogs were pacing the fence line with their low thunder growls, and it was the kind of cold that makes your breath feel like it has weight. I told Tomasz it would be quick. He humored me the way he always had, like when we were 16 and I swore I'd seen a light move under the ice on the Vltava, and he told me it was methane. He pointed his flashlight at the house next door and said, "If anyone asks, we're checking the wall for damage." I taped the paper and rubbed the wax neck and shoulders over it until my hand cramped. The Hebrew came up like a photo in a darkroom. The letters were crisp with tiny chiseled chatter marks you could feel with a thumbnail. When I pulled the paper off and smoothed it on my leg, Tomasz went quiet in his particular way that means he's thinking about how something should be impossible and not saying it out loud. He looked at the stone itself. The stone looked back with ordinary texture. If you wanted to argue, you could say our rubbing had pressed patterns out of nothing. He didn't argue. He said, "Put the rubbing in the office. Mark the date. Don't tell Novak yet. He'll take a hammer to it." On Friday, I came in early because Clara wanted to meet for lunch near Namjesty Jiří, and I thought I'd sneak in an extra check. The morning was white and glassy. People in coats, tram bells like small spoons. The Liedek stone was in check again. It wasn't exactly the same as Tuesday. The diacritics over the letters were cleaner, as if a careful hand had just redrawn what time had blurred. For a second, I had a picture of someone kneeling at the grave with a headlamp sweating in the cold, chiseling in the dark while the neighbors' dogs went insane. I looked at the ground for chips and saw a scatter of dust like ash pressed into the mud by boot prints. My boot prints. Or that's what I told myself. At lunch, I told Clara I was annoyingly fixated on a stone. She rolled her eyes but smiled. "She's a nurse and has a nurse's tolerance for obsession. Working nights makes you weird," she said. "You're turning into one of those men who write letters to the newspaper about pigeons. What does it say?" She asked then. Genuine curiosity in the way she always examined a bruise gently before telling a kid it would be okay. "Let me forget what I've seen," I said. She stirred her soup and said, "That feels more like a hospital than a cemetery thing." After a beat, she added, "What do you think he wanted to forget?" "I don't know if it's a he," I said, and she rolled her eyes again and said I was being pedantic to avoid the actual question. That night, I pressed flour around the edges of the stone where it met the base, like dusting for footprints. It's a stupid trick. I saw it in a detective show, but I wanted to know if anyone touched it. In the morning, a faint arc of flour had fallen away where you'd brace your knee if you were steadying yourself to carve. Another arc where a hand would go. I wiped my fingers over it and came away with almost nothing. The air was damp. The dogs had barked themselves hoarse and were finally quiet. I started leaving the smallest traps. A hair from my coat caught in the seam of the base. A thread looped around a low chip, a pencil line so faint only I would see it. In the morning, those things were always broken or moved, but never as if someone had been caught and panicked. More like a careful hand had simply not cared about my games. The words kept changing, Czech to German to Hebrew to, once Polish, which I only recognized because of the rhythm of the syllables and because Tomasz's grandmother muttered prayers in it when she forgot we were in the room. Another time I found it written in long-closed Habsburg bureaucrat German, all stiff capitals. Another in Yiddish that hung at the corners like a tired mouth, at least as far as I could tell from the rubbing I made. We brought in a city inspector eventually. You can only keep your mouth shut so long when you're responsible for property. He was a young man, very sure of his keen eye and the weight of his clipboard. He took photographs. He clicked his tongue the way people do to show they are paying attention. He said moisture cycle and spalling and suggested a protective acrylic that would make vandalism more difficult. We stood there like three bad students and nodded at the right points in his lecture. When he left, Tomasz said, "If you put acrylic on that, it will write on the acrylic." We didn't put anything on it. You're going to ask if we tried to dig. I thought about it. The thing is, graves have a way they settle. You can tell which ones were disturbed. This one had that comfortable look of a place not touched in a very long time. The way willow roots had curved around the base and someone had left a rusted pin in the dirt. And nobody had stolen it because who steals pins from the dead? Novak would have fired me for suggesting we pry. Not because he loved the dead, but because he respected the paperwork they represented. Also, I was afraid. Not of a body. Bodies are simple. I was afraid that if we lifted the stone, the words would not be there anymore, as if the fact of the stone was the only thing holding them in place. I started hearing the rasp at home. There are a lot of scrapes and scuffs in a cheap flat. Pipes talk. Upstairs neighbors drag chairs late and early. But this sound had that exact schoolroom cadence, the even lifting and placing of a hand that knows where words go. It came from the wall by my bed. I moved my bed. It came from the wall by my desk. I put on music. It threaded under the music, a quiet comb straightening a tangle. I called Clara and told her I was being stupid. She said, "I'm coming over." She came with a bag of groceries and cooked enough for 3 days. She slept on my couch and in the morning she said, very neutral, that she had dreamed someone leaned over her with their ear pressed to her face to hear her breath, and the breath smelled like snow. "Hospitals make people dream worse things," she said, and we both pretended that was context and not a verdict. I tried to avoid the Ledex stone, the way you try not to look at a person you're sure has recognized you from somewhere you didn't mean to be. But avoidance is a loop. You draw the shape of the thing in your mind every time you step around it. Stanya stopped me one Thursday and said, "You're walking in circles." I said I was counting headstones. She said, "No, you're walking in circles." Then she put a carnation at another grave and took my arm and said in a voice that belonged to my grandmother, "Whatever it asks, don't answer in the language it last used. That's how you get stuck." "Who told you that?" I asked, because that's the only rational question. She blinked and looked embarrassed, like I'd pointed out that she'd left lipstick on a glass. "I don't remember," she said, and patted my arm like I was the one who had frightened her. There were small, ordinary proofs of the weirdness if you wanted them. A policeman came to take a report about a broken latch on the south gate and noticed my stack of rubbings on the office desk. "My grandfather used to do those when he cataloged battle memorials," he said. He lifted one between two fingers. It happened to be the German one. He frowned. "I read this, but I'm not reading it," he said, and then he laughed and said, "Ignore me. I've got 3 hours of sleep." He filed his report and left. I watched him walk to the main gate, stop and touch the left-hand pillar like men touch mezuzahs, which the pillar is not. Little gestures people make to unseen things. I started putting salt at the base. A stupid folk thing I had no business doing and don't really believe in. In the morning, the salt was gone. Melted, trampled, carried away by cats. I brought my camera and took a photo every hour from 8 at night to 4 in the morning. Every photo looked the same. I left the camera overnight and came back to find the memory card full of noise that looked like static or snow. The last night begins ordinary. It's easy to be lulled by ordinary. Snow predicted, but not yet. The city holding its breath in a different way. Tomasz at home with a cold, sending me videos of his cat needing a blanket. Clara at the hospital, night shift too, texting me about a patient who thinks he's on a ship because the ceiling tiles make squares like decks. Novak with a scarf looped around his neck twice, nodding off over a crossword. I did my rounds. I checked the lower wall where teenagers jump after a party and leave cigarette butts. I set right a plastic vase a wind had knocked down. I did not go to the Ledex stone. I made tea in the office and read a few pages of a book about bridges because bridges make sense even when they fall. At around 2, the heater made that coughing chain of sounds it makes when it's about to stop. It did not stop. The chain just continued like someone kept pulling an old bell rope. I got up. My keys weighed the same as always. My boots fitted my feet like always. I stepped outside. Snow had started and was falling in flakes so fat you could count their corners. The neighbors' dogs were asleep, noses along their paws, eyelids flickering. The chapel was a dark shape wearing a thin white hood. I walked a route that did not include the old section and found myself standing in front of the old section. Because you cannot outwalk the thing that is pointed precisely at you. The Ledex stone looked narrower with the snow swallowing its base. I stood a meter away. I thought of the rabbi's hands. I thought of the inspector's clipboard. I thought of the way the skin on my palm had looked after I scrubbed it. I said aloud, because the night makes confession easy, "I saw you." I don't want to see anymore. There was no one kneeling. There was the shape snow makes when it falls against a vertical surface, and the heat of the surface licks a path down, and the snow slumps in little tide lines. There was the sound of writing. Not loud, not meant for me. The epitaph was in nothing again, strokes and suggestions and the bones of letters. Then it snapped into English. Not for long. Long enough to read the sentence and feel my body go colder than the air. "Let me forget what I've seen. What did you see?" I asked, because some questions are hooks and some are nets, and I needed to know which this one was. My voice did not carry farther than my teeth. The writing paused. That's the only way I can describe it. The sound didn't stop. It stretched between motions like a breath between sentences. In the pause, I heard a tram 2 streets over. The bell a small, brave sound. I heard Novak turn in his chair and mutter a crossword clue. I heard, through the snow, the scratch of a pencil somewhere far away. The writing started again. The strokes shuffled themselves into Hebrew, then into German, then into Czech. No matter what they used to say, the words said the same thing. I reached out. "Because you do. You touch the hot stove. You touch the bruise. You touch the thing nobody asked to be touched because we are built with hands. My fingertips brushed stone and that same freezer burn sang up my nerves and made my teeth ache. Something under the stone moved. Not a worm. Not a root. Something that moves the way your memory moves when you feel your hand find a light switch in the dark. There was pressure. There was the sense of a palm pressed on the other side of the stone answering mine. The word shifted under my hand, not into a different alphabet, but into something I recognized in the way you recognize your name said in a crowd. The letters were my handwriting. Not perfectly, but that way the cross on the T is always a little late. The loop on the Y is too tight. Let me forget what I've seen. It looked back at me like a mirror. I took my hand away. The words went back, a shuffle, tired. The snow hissed strangely around my boots like I was standing in a kettle just before boil. A shape of a kneeling person was in the snow without anybody having knelt. The palm print that blackened the powder was next to mine and fit like two pieces of a jigsaw laid wrong and still determined to be together. I didn't tell Tomasz the full of it. He came back to work with his cold half gone, and I handed him the keys and said, "Watch the north wall." He squinted at me and said, "You look like you fell asleep on a tram and woke up at the last stop." He brought me a pastry that tasted like honey and butter and didn't ask why I held it in my left hand like the right was no longer entirely mine. Clara texted me a photo of a hallway with the caption "Ship Ahoy," and I almost told her about the handwriting, then decided not to put it in her head. When she came by 2 days later, she stood at the Ledex stone for a long time and didn't touch it, and then said casually, "Do you remember when we were kids and we got lost by the river and you said there were lights under the ice?" I said I remembered. She said, "Sometimes memory is a thing that remembers you back." And then she left half the soup in the thermos and told me to finish it, so she could pretend we were doing normal sibling things. The city inspector emailed that he'd close our file, and that if we had further issues, there were new guidelines regarding historical inscriptions. The rabbi sent me a link to a paper about palimpsests with a note that said, "Some texts keep writing themselves even when nobody is pushing the pen." Stanya stopped coming. Or maybe she came and I didn't see her. Or maybe she never existed beyond that lipstick and the smell of wool. The dogs have stopped barking at night. Sometimes they stand with their noses at the fence and breathe the air like it has a memory they can taste. I went to a rabbi. I didn't introduce myself to him with anything more than a first name and the word caretaker. He was younger than I expected, and his office smelled like stale coffee and lemon cleaner. I showed him the rubbings, laid out an order across his desk like a stuttering timeline. He touched each one with his index finger and his thumb pressed together, the way people do when they want to keep their hands from doing something else. He said the Hebrew and Yiddish both said exactly that. Let me forget what I've seen. But the grammar was strange. The kind of strange you get when someone has a mother tongue and a ghost tongue. He asked where the stone was. I lied and said a village. He didn't press. He asked me if I had seen vandalism. I said no. He asked me if I had heard anything at night. I said only dogs. He gave me a look like he knew there were other answers I was choosing not to say. Then he told me to avoid treating it like a puzzle. Sometimes puzzles want to be solved, he said in careful check. Sometimes they want to be passed along, I told Novak eventually. He laughed the way men laugh when they are uncomfortable and said, "Stones sink, inscriptions shift. Bring a brush. Don't tell the city. They'll send inspectors." But his hands shook when he lit his cigarette. And later I found he had penciled over a crossword clue 3 times without writing any letters. There was a woman who came once a month to put carnations at a family plot near the old wall. Her name was Stanya. Her lipstick was always precisely applied and always the wrong color for winter. She asked me once why I always stop at the same stone. I told her the epitaph interested me. She said, "It used to say something else." I asked her what. She thought for a long time, then shook her head. "I don't remember," she said, and then she laughed at herself and said, "Maybe someone asked to forget." The night of the first snow, the lights went out. Not just in the office, the whole block. The dogs shut up like someone had put hands over their muzzles. The air made that hollow feeling you get when the city goes quiet all at once. Novak swore and rattled the breaker as if that would bring the grid back. Tomasz put on his headlamp and said, "Come on, Adam, let's check the transformer by the wall." We went out together, our breathing stupidly loud. Snow was powdering the angels on the chapel and catching in spider webs and making the ground into an idea of itself. My headlamp found the Ledex stone because even in the dark I knew where it was by the bend of the path and the uncertain shadow of a linden. Someone was kneeling there. I say someone, but what I mean is a shape that had the right number of limbs and the right way of holding weight. A person in workman's clothes kneeling like a mason, one knee pressed in, one foot flexed for leverage. Their head was bent, and what made my skin crawl wasn't the silhouette, it was the sound. It wasn't a chisel. It was the steady rasp you make when you write on stone with a dull piece of slate. It was the sound of school somehow, wrong in the snow. Tomasz said, "Hello?" Because Tomasz will be polite to a burglar and a landlord right up until it's time to swing. The person didn't turn. They reached a hand to the base of the stone, where the flakes of snow had not yet stuck, and their fingers left clean streaks like something hot had melted the new surface. My headlamp found pale sleeves rolled to the elbow and the small white underside of wrist where the veins show. Ordinary. The light slid up to catch their ear, and I thought that's not an ear. Not because of the shape, but because the ear was too smooth. No ridges. For a second I thought of mannequins, which is ridiculous because mannequins do not kneel in cemeteries to write in snow. Tomasz grabbed my jacket sleeve so hard my shoulder joint burned. He said, "Don't," in a voice he used. Exactly once before when we were kids and I almost stepped on a snake sunning itself on the edge of a trail. I didn't even know what I was about to do, but he stopped it. He shone his light at the stone instead of the kneeling shape, which is maybe the only reason I am here typing. The epitaph was half finished. It wasn't in Czech or German. It wasn't in any language at all, and that was what made my stomach turn. It was a line of strokes, each at the same angle, each spaced like someone measuring with a compasses, like the first idea of writing before writing became useful. Not runes, not pictographs, just strokes. And you could tell that, by the end of the line, those strokes would be letters if you had the right eyes to read them. The shape put its palm on the stone the way you steady a page, and the snow hissed under its hand like oil in a hot pan when a drop hits. Tomasz lifted his light and, without meaning to, hit the head. The person's head turned. Not to us. The head turned so the ear face pointed at the snow. The other side, the side I had thought was turned away, had no features either. Just that slight suggestion of where features should go, like the point on a sculptor's rough-out where they mark the nose with a thumb. The only parts that had definition were the hands. The fingers were slick with something that wasn't wet but reflected the light like wet doughs. Not blood, not oil. Something that made the snow crust and sink a little when it fell on the fingers. I said very softly, "Stop." Not to the thing, but to myself, as if the word could slow the part of me that was walking toward the stone. Tomasz said my name in a hiss like he'd turned into the neighbor's dogs. I put my hand out. It's astonishing, looking back, how much of our bodies want to touch. You see something and your fingers go there. The weight of my hand on the cold stone felt like pushing into a cool loaf of bread. Give is the wrong word. Yield is closer. The unfinished strokes seemed to tremble. The kneeling figure lifted its hand and pressed its palm next to mine, and it felt like sticking your hand into the back of a freezer, where frost is so dry it squeaks. "Adam," Tomasz said. "Adam, stop." The lights came back then, all at once. Sodium yellow blazed into the white night, and the tram bells clanged 2 streets over, and the dogs started up, and it was like the city took a breath again. The kneeling figure jerked, not like a person reacting to surprise, but like a puppet hitting the end of string. The strokes on the stone smoothed themselves into letters in an alphabet I should have known and didn't. They shifted again. They became German. They became Czech. For the smallest slice of a second, they were English. Let me forget what I've seen. Then they dropped back into Hebrew, like a rock settling in a riverbed. The figure put its hand flat to the base once more, and the snow under its palm blackened. A perfect print of nothing. We ran. I would like to say we were brave and strategic and did something like follow or phone someone or lock a gate, but we did not. We ran to the office and slammed the door, and Novak yelled at us for tracking snow on the mat. Tomasz told him to shut up in a voice that made Novak shut up. We sat in the plastic chairs meant for grieving relatives who needed to sign paperwork and listen to the heater cough. My hand ached like I'd been holding a stone for half an hour. I looked at my palm and there was a thin film on it, like something dried there, like what you get on your hands when you handle old books. That combination of dust and whatever time steeps out of paper. I went to the bathroom and scrubbed until the film thinned and disappeared and the skin under it looked raw. The next morning, the epitaph was in check, layered, as if there were letters under the letters, as if every language had been written on top of every other. I ran my fingers across and felt a texture like the growth rings of a tree. It made me think of Clara saying hospitals make you forget in slices, like days cut thin. She came by with a thermos of decent tea that Saturday night and laughed at my headlamp, then stood in front of the stone and got quiet. She reached out and then pulled back like the stone was hot. She whispered, without meaning to, "Let me forget what I've seen," and then looked at me like I had pushed her shoulder. "I didn't mean to say that," she said. "I thought it," she said. Then she went back to the office and drank the whole thermos. I still work there. People think the moral of these stories is that you should quit and run. But the truth is you don't. You go to work. You check the locks. You count the vases that the wind knocked over. You get very good at making tea that doesn't taste like metal. And sometimes you stand in front of a stone and you let whatever is under your skin align with whatever is under the stone. And you tell yourself that it's just language being language, disguising itself the way cats disguise themselves as coats on chairs. And sometimes when a tram bell rings at 2, you hear the stroke of writing pause and you feel something on the other side of that glass-thin wall of world pay attention and then, mercifully, look away. On 3 mornings out of 7 now, the epitaph is in English first. Not for long. Long enough that I know if I brought someone new they'd catch it, if they were the kind of person whose hands touch without being told. I don't bring anyone. I've stopped doing rubbings. I keep the old ones in a folder that I moved once and now cannot find. I sleep with my bed pulled away from every wall. The rasp follows anyway. Some nights it comes from the door, some nights from the window. Once I woke with my palm against the headboard and a heat in the wood that took the varnish dull. When I pulled my hand away, there was a smudge, not black, not white, just a lack of gloss in the shape of the heel of my hand. I put a poster over it like a teenager hiding a hole. It didn't help. The sound doesn't care about wood or stone. It cares about the part of you that says maybe if I say the right words, the thing will stop asking. Last week, someone slid a note under the office door. No envelope. Folded twice. Inside, a sentence written in careful, old-fashioned script. Nech mě zapomenout, co jsem viděl. Let me forget what I've seen. There was no signature. The paper smelled very faintly like snow. Novak said he found it in the morning. I said maybe someone had a sense of humor. He nodded and put it in his crossword book, and then later, I saw him take it out and smooth it like you'd smooth a shirt on a body you were dressing for a last time. I wonder sometimes if the stone is collecting languages the way stones collect lichen, that there is no original inscription under there at all, only the pressure of many attempts to say the same thing. Maybe the person who was buried there saw one small private thing and could not keep it. Maybe they saw all of it, and language is the only way the mind can bend around that kind of edge without cutting itself. Maybe the thing under the stone is nothing more than the ordinary work of forgetting, which is writing over and over and over. I shouldn't have touched it. That's the cleanest way to say it. I shouldn't have wanted proof as much as I did. But want is what the city is built on. Want to cross, want to look down from bridges, want to be older than you are. So I did. And now I wake some nights with a sentence half carved behind my eyes and can't remember if I wrote it in sleep. Now I walk the cemetery at dusk with my right hand in my pocket like I'm hiding a burn. Now I pour a little tea on the ground by the stone. The way my grandmother poured a little beer for saints she swore she didn't believe in, and say out loud, I didn't see anything like that might be a kindness to someone. If you visit, don't. But if you do, you'll know the stone because it will not be the most dramatic or the most tilted. It will be the one your hand goes to without consulting your brain. It will be the one where the letters have the tiniest sense of vibration. If you stand close enough, you will think this is just wind. This is just my pulse. You will, for a second, see your own handwriting in the groove of the sentence, and you will pull back and forget you saw it. That's the part that matters, that you forget. I'm writing this down so I can stop thinking about it for a while. I'm writing this down in a language that feels like a coat I borrowed from a friend and forgot to return. I will close my laptop and the rasp will start up like a polite neighbor sweeping a step. Maybe I'll sleep anyway. Maybe the dogs will stay quiet. Maybe the snow will come and cover everything and the stone will be just another tall gray shape wearing a winter hat. In the morning I'll make tea. I'll count vases. I'll stop at the Lidex stone and I won't touch it. I'll read the sentence in whatever clothes it is put on for the day, and I'll stand there long enough to breathe once and then I'll walk away. If you told me I had a choice, I would believe you. If you asked me what language it will use tomorrow, I would tell you I don't know and I don't want to know. But I can already feel the words finding my hand, and I can already feel the part of me that will be thankful for the mercy of not remembering, and I can already see the sentence bright on stone in a handwriting I recognize in the worst way. Let me forget what I've seen. If forgetting is a door, then it has my palm print on it now, and I wonder which side I'm on when it closes. I wasn't planning to write about this at all, because when you live on a rock of frozen coal and old bones, you learn to keep certain things to yourself, but I haven't slept right in weeks and the quiet makes the memory louder. So here it is. I worked as a winter caretaker for the cemetery outside Longyearbyen on Svalbard. If you've heard anything about it, you probably know the trivia. The ground stays so cold that bodies don't really decompose, and for a long time they avoided burying people, because the permafrost preserves more than it should. My job wasn't digging. It was tending to the fence after storms, checking for wind scour, making sure the little wooden markers didn't vanish under drifts, and shooing tourists in the shoulder seasons. In the polar night, it's mostly me, a snowmobile, a thermos, and a row of crosses that catch and hold whatever light the town throws up against the sky. I did that last winter, the long one when even the diesel from the generators had a sweeter smell in the air, like a warning you noticed too late. I shared a house with two others, Mikkel, who fixed snowmobiles for half the town and drank coffee strong enough to polish metal, and Lena, a nurse who rotated through the clinic and the mining museum depending on who was sick and who was in town. Mikkel and I had come up the same summer for payday and stayed because the place gets under your nails. Lena grew up farther north and said Svalbard still felt like the attic of the world, full of things people didn't know what to do with. We were a good trio. Mikkel laughed at the wrong parts of stories. Lena collected quiet details like birds, and I had the keys to too many sheds. The week this started, the weather had settled into that stubborn kind of cold, where the snow squeaks under your boots and the air is so clear, it feels like something is missing. You learn routines up there. You check the aurora forecast even if you're only going to the store. You hang your headlamp by the door every time with fresh batteries. You glance at the bear bulletin and carry the rifle you hope you never touch. You don't cut across certain flats if the wind's from the south. I learned, too, how the cemetery sounded, the way the fence slats complained in a northerly, the way the drifts laid themselves down like sleeping dogs between the rows. On the first night I noticed anything wrong, there was a whiteout warning on the radio, but the sky above the lights was clear enough that I took the machine out to the cemetery to beat the storm and tie extra ropes between the markers. It's a trick old caretakers taught me. Rope lines at ankle height so the snow doesn't erase the shapes and you can still find your way. Even if everything turns to milk, I parked at the snow berm and killed the engine. That silence afterward is never complete. The generator's ever-present hum crawled up the valley, and somewhere a storage container door knocked in a patient rhythm. I walked into the rows. My lamp picked out the crosses and the occasional simple stone with a name that had turned to guesses. The snow made a dry sound when I brushed it off with my glove. I had just tied the second line, my breath fogging and freezing on the gator, when I saw someone moving where the rows bend toward the older section. If you've never felt a full-body flinch, I hope you never do. It starts in your ankles and climbs. The figure was a man at first glance, tall, wrapped in something that was white because everything was white, a cloak or a blanket or the kind of coat you only see in photographs of polar expeditions. He was walking calmly, deliberately, not stumbling as you do in deep snow, just crossing the graves like he knew them. He didn't turn when my lamp swept over him. I called out, "It's automatic there, you call before you shoulder your rifle," and he didn't respond. I thought drunk tourist, and then I thought worse, and I started moving faster. He kept his pace, and I saw his footsteps when my beam hit the ground behind him. They were clear and deep, the sharp edges you get when the surface crust holds and your weight cuts through. I followed. The wind was nothing yet, so the prints held. Perfect boot ovals spaced like a metronome, He went through the oldest section where the wooden markers sit low, and then out beyond where the fence does a lazy jog around a snowed-in iron gate, and then he stopped. I could see his shape against the faint lighter patch that was the town sky, a shape of shoulders and a hood. I lifted my lamp to his face and got nothing. He wasn't there. The light opened on the valley and made a vertical column in the haze, and the last print was at my feet. I crouched with my glove on that final impression and felt the strangest thing. The snow around my hand wasn't just undisturbed. It was warm, in a way that was insulting to your fingers. I pressed harder and it sank as if the crust had thawed. I thought about vents, about a mine opening I didn't know. Some sneaky worm of warm air from the town pipes under the road. But there was nothing around. Just a clean white surface with a shallow basin of boot prints leading to it and a dead stop. Steam doesn't show at those temperatures unless it's strong and fast, and there was no steam. But the heat was there, seeping like breath. I sat there with my glove on the snow until it cooled. When I stood up, something else made the hair behind my ears lift. The rope line I'd tied 20 minutes before shifted under its own weight like it was being tested from the far end. A slow, polite tug. I turned my lamp that way and saw only the crosses lined up like men waiting for orders. "Okay," I said out loud, "because you're supposed to tell the air what you're doing so you hear your own voice." "Okay." Then the wind came and erased the sound of my boots, and I decided to call it. On the way back, I looked behind me more times than I'll admit. The prints I had followed were already softening at the edges. Mine were sharp and messy. At the berm, I heard a single hollow thump from the cemetery's little wooden tool shed, the sound a shovel makes when it tips against a wall. Later, when I checked, nothing inside had fallen. I told Mikkel and Lena at breakfast, doing the thing where you laugh about it while your hands tell on you by holding the mug too tight. Mikkel said maybe I'd followed a tourist in a white snowsuit who took the world's neatest long jump. Lena frowned and asked where exactly the prints stopped. When I said the older section, she nodded like it fit into a drawer in her head. "Pastor Olaf says the old graves settle sometimes and make pockets," she said. "Heat can register strange there if the wind's right." "Heat registers strange?" Mikkel echoed, but he was already back to his carburetor in his mind. I wasn't satisfied with pockets, but I didn't have something better. That day the storm hit hard. The radio hissed with warnings, and the plow made walls of snow you could hide a building behind. I didn't go back out until the next night, when the wind calmed in that sharp way that makes the cold bite more. I told myself it was to check the rope lines. In truth, I wanted to see if the weirdness had blown off with the storm. As I approached, my headlamp picked up something like tiny glitter in the air, ice crystals hanging despite the lack of wind. The ropes were intact. The little flags I'd tied to the fence for tourists fluttered as if remembering how. I walked the rows deliberately, counting the steps between markers, tapping each cross with my glove to knock off the hard crust. Twice I thought I heard a footstep behind me, and twice it was a clump of snow sliding off a post. Then near the same place I felt heat on my shin through the insulated pants like I'd stood too close to a heater. I pointed the beam down. There was a shallow rise in the snow, about the size of a sleeping person. No prints let in or out. When I put my glove to it, it was warm. Not melt, not hot, but the kind of warmth you find in the crook of a sofa where someone just got up. I stayed until the cold ate my face through the mask. On the way home, the radio crackled on my jacket, and for a moment I thought I heard singing between the static. Not quite a melody, more like a low human note drawn out and steady. Lena, when I told her, asked if I knew old hymns. I don't. She said some of the nurses sing when they're counting stitches because it keeps the hand steady. "Maybe you caught a frequency," she said. Mikkel said warm snow was a sign I'd been outside too long and my nerves had a fever. He held up a spark plug with his gloves and grinned. On the third night, I brought a little industrial thermometer probe from the supply room. It's a stick with a cable and a small readout, meant for checking the temperature in stored diesel and frozen food. I trudged out alone again because no one volunteers for the cemetery when the night has teeth. I found the spot by memory. Your body remembers more than your eyes do in the polar night. The snow there looked ordinary in my beam, a low pillow, undisturbed. I plunged the probe in my fist into the drift up to my elbow and watched the numbers. The air readout hovered at 23 degrees Celsius. The snow at arm's depth read 22, 21, and then a little pocket flashed, 6 like a skipped heartbeat, and then sank back. I did it again and got the same blip. On the third try, I kept the probe there. and felt the warmth of the pocket abrade my skin through the glove. It felt like a palm pressed back. I admit I said a few things aloud to prove I wasn't one of the ones who stopped having a border between the inside voice and the outside world. I'm testing the snow, I told no one. I'm going to mark this and then I'm going home. I slid a little blue surveyor's flag into the drift and tied a loop of rope from a nearby cross to it, because at night everything loses scale, and the loop would help my hands know where to go if my head failed. When I stood up, I saw a second set of footprints in the beam to my left. They came from nowhere, crossed the row, paused near my boot, and then led off toward the low gate and the world beyond. The prints were crisp, the way things are when they're new, the same boot size as before. I followed them a few steps and then stopped. Because there is a point where every story you've heard about people vanishing in whiteouts opens like a trapdoor under your foot, and you realize you've been standing on the handle the whole time. I took out my radio and keyed it. "Mikkel," I said, because it felt easier to conjure him than the governor's watch. "You around?" Static, then his voice like sandpaper. "Always you at your ghost farm?" I told him where I was and what I saw. He swore, then laughed the way you do when you're trying to put a leash on the fear. "I'll come out," he said. "Stay put." He arrived in 6 minutes, which meant he was already half-dressed and had only pretended to be casual. His headlamp was brighter than mine and made a second sun. We followed the prints together this time. A few minutes in, the lamps made a little blizzard of silver gnats, and then the sky vanished sideways like a thought you can't hold. Whiteout. It happens that fast. We did what you're supposed to do. We clipped our carabiners to the rope line I'd set between the markers earlier. We crouched to lower our profiles. We didn't talk much. I kept my glove on the rope, inching us forward, and we both watched our feet like something rare was growing from the snow. The footprints kept ahead of us, always at the edge of where our beams decided to show us a world. Every time we reached where the man had been, the prints went on. And then, just like the other night, the last pair ended at an ordinary patch of snow. But there was a sound this time that wasn't wind. It was a tiny, steady hiss like breath moving through teeth. The warmth was stronger, too. When I pressed my palm into the drift, it gave and held like a chest rising. Mikkel swore again and said his grandmother had stories about people who laid down in the snow, and the snow learned them. "It's heat bleed from a pipe," he said immediately after, mean to his own superstition. He stabbed a gloved finger into the drift. "I'll dig." We took turns with a short shovel from the bag. The snow surprised us by being dense and then oddly soft in layers like an unmade bed. We dug a hole the size of a person and found nothing but snow. At the bottom, the heat was strongest. We set the shovel down and watched our breath blow into the hole like offerings. I told him about the radio hymn. He didn't laugh at it this time. "You shouldn't come here alone," he said, and I didn't argue. The next day, I asked Pastor Olav if there were warm spots in the cemetery. He is a thin man with iron hands who never wears his hat long enough. He held his coffee and looked at me like I'd asked if the crosses ever walked. "Not warm," he said, and then added, "The ground can hold. It can also move." I told him about the footsteps. He closed his eyes for a moment in that way old men do when they're measuring whether a thing will grow if they say it out loud. "This isn't a Christian place the way you think it is," he said finally. "It's a place where people asked for a stop between one cold and the next. They left things here. Not everything knows it left." He offered to walk with me that night. I said yes. I didn't tell Lena because she had enough of other people's bodies and would ask the right questions with the wrong kind of concern. We went out after 9. The snow had fallen all day and now lay fresh and full of its own light under the headlamps. The stars were oddly bright for a place with 2 power plants and signed warnings about polar bears. We moved along the rope lines in silence, boots whispering. At the gate, Olav paused and looked up at the valley where the miners used to haul in sledges. He said something in Norwegian that I didn't know because my Norwegian lives in menus and parts lists. The wind answered like a tired bird. We crossed into the old section. I remember the precise sound of one wooden cross rubbing its neighbor, a small tired creak. And I remember thinking that if I didn't note details, my mind would slide over the whole night and call it a dream. At the flag, the snow had made a gentle mound around the stick. I crouched and put my palm down. Warm. I felt shame at a child's relief that someone else was there to feel it too. "Yes," Olav said quietly, as if we had confirmed a recipe. "And what now?" Before I could answer, his lamp caught something moving. In the far end of the row, a figure stepped between 2 markers. He was taller than me by a head, shoulders black against the white because he was wrapped in a cloak of snow that had crusted and darkened at the seams. He moved the same as before, same even pace, same disregard for us. The prince came after. I don't know why I did it, but I stepped ahead of him, a meter off his path, and raised my palm like a crossing guard. "Hey," I called, gentle but firm. "Stop a second." Mikkel would have laughed at my tone. The figure kept moving until my light hit where the face would be. For the first time it reacted. It dipped its head slightly like a man averting his eyes. Then it turned left without changing speed and started in a new direction, still toward the outer fence. The prince rotated under him as if the snow had spun too. We followed without speaking. The whiteout didn't come that night. Instead, the air got cleaner and the cold sharper, and our lamps made two narrow cones that felt obscene in their intrusion. The man reached the low fence and stepped as if to sail through it. His cloak shook a little in a wind that wasn't there, and then, like the first time, he ended at nothing. He wasn't. The snow was. We stood over the dead stop of his passage, and I put my glove down and felt heat radiating up, slow and certain. Not dangerous heat which hisses and spits and melts like fury, but body heat, the way it gathers in a sleeping bag. "He is looking for a place," Olav said in a voice that sounded heavier than he was. "Or he is not ready to leave the place he found." I told him about the footsteps arising from nowhere and returning to nowhere, and about the hissing like teeth. He nodded. "The town pipes don't run here," he said, almost to himself. "And the mine is the other way." He eyed the fence in the direction of the old miners' barracks that aren't there anymore. "There are stories about the influenza dead," he added, and I thought of the preserved bodies that made the newspaper when people dug them up to study the virus, and the way the articles always mention that Svalbard keeps what you give it. "I don't think this is that," I said, because the idea of a virus as a ghost was too big. "No," he agreed. "This is something smaller." I asked what, and he smiled the way I hate, with the kindness that says I can't give you the thing you're asking for without losing something I can't lose. We started seeing him on the edges of everything after that. Lena saw him once from the clinic window, a white-shouldered thing moving against the wind that was trying to push the fence over. She told me only that she'd watched him move and then watched the prince afterward. "You should tell the governor," she said, using the formal word everyone uses even if they know the man's first name. I said, "What? That a warm place in the snow keeps putting on a cloak and walking?" She shrugged and said, "Tell Mikkel then," like that was the same. Mikkel started coming out with me more often, mostly for the joke of it, but also because I saw him carry the spare rope like a rosary. We experimented. We set a metal bowl over the warm spot and watched the frost on its sweat. We stuck the probe down once every hour and wrote the numbers in a cheap notebook. We put our hands flat to our own chests after each visit to make sure we could tell the difference between our heat and what was under there. The hissing came and went, always at the edge of hearing, like the sublimation of somewhere far away. 2 weeks in, the footprints started to show up nearer to town. A police officer named Carrie. She sells me boots sometimes in her off hours. Like everyone does 3 jobs. Showed me a path of prints that cut across a parking lot and stopped at the road's edge where the plow had left a low wall. "A guy in a white coat?" she asked. Her breath made dragons in the light. "Tall?" I hesitated because I wasn't sure what counted as reporting versus making new weather with the things you say. "Probably the same," I said. "He's been around the cemetery." She nodded and said something about kids and challenges she didn't understand. "If it's a person," she added, "the way you say if it's an elk, I'd rather talk to him than to the person who finds him after a storm." After she left, I looked at the top of the plow wall where the print stopped and held my palm over it like a diviner. The heat ghosted up, faint and unmistakable. If you think I'm stretching the truth now, I don't blame you. I've never liked stories that ask you to swallow too much at once. I can only say that there are kinds of knowledge that lodge in you the way cold does. You stop doubting them because you can't make them leave. The climax, if that's what this was building toward, came on a Thursday night, when the wind was from the east and the kind of crystals that form thin plates instead of needles were floating like a halo around everything. It felt like weather remembered from a photograph. I went out alone because I'd told myself I wouldn't make other people part of it anymore. The Bear Bulletin had 3 sightings, but all down by the shore, and the rifle felt heavy on my shoulder. I walked the rope lines, checked the flags, and then stood by the warm place and listened. The hissing was pronounced. almost like someone whispering foolishness to a stove. I said out loud because I was past pretending I didn't talk to the air. "What do you want?" It felt good to hear my voice not tremble. There was no answer, just the sense of the snow breathing. Then from behind me came the soft, deliberate crunch of a footstep, and again, 5 in total, equal in spacing, exactly like the ones I'd followed all month. I turned slowly, beam low, and there he was. Not quite fully in my light, but held the way dust motes are held in a window. The cloak wasn't snow after all, but something older, rough and woven, now white with accumulation. The hood shadowed the face in a way that wasn't a trick of my light. He stopped a meter from me and stood very still, and I understood in a way I don't like that we were both waiting for something we hadn't agreed upon. I did the thing you do for an injured skier. I kept my voice even and told him my name and said I wanted to help him get to shelter. I told him it was too cold to be out alone and too late to find his way by feel. I said there was a good chance the weather would turn ugly, even if it looked polite. He didn't answer, but the shape of his shoulders shifted the way people's do when they are listening while they decide whether to listen. I took a slow step forward and made sure my beam didn't hit his face. "I'll walk ahead," I said. "You can follow my prints. We'll take the line to the gate. You'll be inside in 5 minutes and I'll make tea." This last word felt ridiculous in my mouth, like something I'd read and decided to try. He tilted his head at it the way an animal does at a sound it recognizes from another lifetime. Then he turned precisely as if pivoting on a hinge and started to move. Not toward the gate, but toward the far fence, the place where his path always went. I moved to block him, not with force, but with a librarian's politeness, and put my hand out. He stopped again. The snow hissed warmer. A low wind came out of nowhere and patted our coats. There was a pause, and in the pause the long, steady note I'd heard on the radio slid between our lamps. A human sound without words. For a second I thought it was coming from me. Then he stepped lightly to the left like a dancer and went past me. The rope trembled as he passed it, as if he had brushed it, and when he reached the usual spot the world swallowed him. I didn't dig. I wanted to, but I didn't. Instead I sank to my knees because the snow was suddenly soft enough to take them, and pressed my ear to the drift. If you've ever put your ear to a friend's chest and tried to hear anything besides your own blood, you'll know the frustration of what I'm going to say. I heard something, and I don't have the vocabulary to make it convincing. It wasn't a heartbeat. It wasn't air. It was a regular small sound, steady and stubborn, like a stitch pulled through fabric and back, like something being mended very slowly and very much on purpose. I lay there with my cheek burning from the cold and listened until the sound either stopped or became the only thing there was. When I stood, my knees burned the way skin does when you warm it too fast. I backed away to the rope. The wind picked up in a single indifferent breath and blew crystals at my face. I started home. Halfway there, my radio cracked and popped, and then a voice, a human voice, said my name in a normal tone, as if someone had set a mug down on a table and remembered I was in the room. "You should leave a door open," the voice said, calm and unadorned. Static ate the rest. I clicked the button and said redundancy words I hadn't used since a first aid course. Say again. Nothing but the hiss. When I got home, Lena and Mikkel were at the table, a deck of cards between them, like it was a normal thing to pretend the night outside wasn't older than God. I must have looked like I'd seen the guts of a machine, because Lena stood without finishing her hand. "Sit," she said. "We made dinner 3 hours ago. It's still fine." I told them about the voice and the way the snow had made the mending sound and how I hadn't dug. Mikkel didn't make a joke this time. He went to the door and checked the lock we always keep set but never loud, and then he propped it with the rubber wedge we use in summer to make the night soft. "A door open," he said, shrugging when we looked at him. "It costs nothing." We left it that way while we ate, while the lamp made its circle on the floor, while the wind thought about changing direction. Over the next days, small practical things broke. My probe stopped catching the heat blip and started reading the same cold all the way down. The little survey flag disappeared. Not blown away, just missing from the stick, as if the green had become more white and decided to move along. The footprints moved closer to the road for a while and then retreated. The hissing came and went. Lena caught a cold and said the infirmary had 3 cases of something that smelled like old pennies. People noticed things. Someone said the church felt warmer than it should before anyone turned the heat on. Someone else said their window got fogged from the outside, which is wrong there. Carrie emailed me a photograph of the parking lot prints and wrote, Tell your friend he's got town privileges now. With a smile I couldn't feel. This is the part where I'm supposed to tie it together, or else admit I lost it. I can't do either. The winter ended slowly, the way it always does there, by strips and leaks and a new quality to the light. The warm spot in the cemetery stopped acting like a sleeping body and started acting like snow. We still find footprints some nights. They still start from empty ground and end by the fence. When I put my palm down there now, it feels like cold. Not the hatred kind, but the old kind that belongs here. The radio sometimes hisses and sometimes carries one low, steady note that could be anything. Pastor Olaf still nods at me like you nod to someone you have a secret with, but not the same secret. Mikkel replaced my probe without a word, and now he carries the wedge doorstop in his pocket like a joke or a ward. Lena said the cases that smelled like pennies cleared up on their own, and that sometimes a burden just shifts to another beam, and you don't have to know which one. I still go out at night. I still tie the rope lines because they help my hands remember where to go when the world forgets its edges. Sometimes I walk past the old section and stop where the warm was and listen without letting the cold numb my ears. I don't hear the mending sound anymore. But sometimes, when the wind is that clean, sharp east and the crystals make a false daylight, I think I see him at the far end of the row, walking with purpose, a cloak that is only snow held up by a shape that has nowhere else to be. If I keep very still and my lamp stays pointed down, he will keep his course and not turn his hood toward me. He isn't quite threatening. He isn't quite lost. He is exactly what the place makes of a certain kind of wish. I go home afterward and leave our door open for a while, even when the weather would prefer it shut. The warm air moves toward the threshold and gathers there, and the house seems to breathe once like a living thing that is reminding you not to think of it as a machine. When I lie down, the mattress holds the day's imprint longer than it should, and sometimes I wake and find the edge of the bed warmer than the middle, as if someone sat and waited for me to notice. People ask me if I believe in ghosts, and I finally have an answer that doesn't feel like pretending. I believe in things that walk until the walking is remembered by the ground. I believe in heat that refuses to admit it's spent. I believe you can follow prints to a place that doesn't exist and still feel what left them. And I believe that some nights, when I lock the door again because even politeness can overstay, there is a figure outside with a cloak of snow and patience. And somewhere beneath the frost there is a steady small sound like someone stitching, and the ground is warmer than it should be, as if a body had been lying there a moment before and rose without leaving, and is waiting for one more stitch. I've rolled my eyes at haunted statue stories my whole life, so I hate that I'm about to be that person. I'm posting this now because I can't sleep without hearing it, and I need to put it somewhere that isn't my head. I'm not asking you to believe me. I just need to write this down how it happened, because when I try to tell it out loud, I start tasting salt. I spent last December in Barcelona, swapping apartments with a friend who needed to be in New York. I was working on a translation and living near Parallel, above a bakery that started banging trays at 5 a.m., and a lottery kiosk where the owner wore different soccer scarves depending on who was playing. My friend Laya is a photographer, street stuff mostly. But that winter she decided to shoot funerary art for a series she called The Quiet City. If you've ever been to Montjuic Cemetery, you know why she picked it. It's not like the green, sprawling cemeteries you picture. It locks into the hillside. Layers of white galleries stacked like bookcases overlooking the sea. Each wall is a grid of niches, glass doors with flowers behind them, names etched into marble. Wind rattles the eucalyptus and you can hear cranes from the port knock around at night. It's beautiful in a way that makes you keep your voice down. The first morning she dragged me up there. The sky was flat and pale, the kind of cold that never looks dramatic in pictures but gets under your jacket. The security guard saw her old press badge and let us through early. The galleries were half in shade. You could smell wax and that faint, sharp scent of the sea. We nodded to a caretaker sweeping cypress needles off the steps, and then Laya disappeared into her tripod and filters. I walked a few rows and read names and dates while I tried to think of anything more cheerful than my own deadline. The caretaker was an older guy in coveralls with a patch that said Rovira. He had thin white hair and a steady way of using his hands like he had been doing this forever. When I circled back, he was polishing a statue at the end of row 7. It was a marble angel, the kind with simple wings and a blank face you see all over Europe. Nothing Baroque about it. Laya snapped a few frames and he joked that she was early for Los Santos Inocentes. I asked him why he was polishing in December and he shrugged and said the caretakers always do a pass before the holidays. Somos gente de habitus, he said, creatures of habit. He showed us the rag he'd been using, and I remember because the fabric was dark, with grime except for one corner that was crusted white. He tapped the angel's cheek with the back of his fingers and then held them up like a magician. Every morning this week, he said, I clean her. Every afternoon she cries again. He said it like someone might say their faucet leaked. Laya and I both laughed. Because what do you say? I figured it was sea spray or fog or something about temperature and stone. He nodded along with our guesses like he'd heard them and wasn't offended, then lifted the rag to my nose. The white crust smelled faintly like the inside of your mouth after you've cried too hard. The rag left a little grit on my upper lip that I licked off without thinking and immediately regretted, because it was salt. We did the obvious things. Laya stepped on the lower ledge and ran her finger along the angel's eyes, then showed me her fingertip, shiny. Not wet exactly. More like it had been damp a minute ago and was already drying. She held it under her camera for a macro shot and frowned. If it's the sea, why here? She said, turning to look down the row where glass doors and marble faces gleamed all dry. It's deep in the gallery, out of the wind. She's not dramatic, Laya. If she's unsettled, she gets quiet. Rovira told us there was no pipe or roof seam above that corner, pointed up to the stone ceiling with its little ventilation openings cut into it. He said he'd check anyway. He took down a tall, dented ladder, the kind that leaves aluminum streaks on your palms, and went up with a flashlight. No wet spots. The niche directly above the angel was empty but sealed. Just a dull white square that anyone who knows Barcelona knows is expensive. He climbed down, wiped his hands, and said he'd been here 35 years, and whatever it wasn't a leak. We came back the next morning and the next. The angel's face had the same faint tracks. The salt dried clear, not dramatic enough to photograph well unless the light hit it just right. Laya tried angles, softer lenses, filtered morning sun. I did nothing useful except bring coffee and paper cups that made our hands feel warmer for 5 minutes. On the third day, a woman in a black coat left a candle near us. She had the tight mouth and swollen eyes of someone for whom the cemetery is a regular stop. She saw us looking at the angel and looked away quickly, then made the sign of the cross the old-fashioned way, with her whole hand, slow and thoughtful. Cuando llora, she said, not to us but to the air. Falta alguien. When she cries, someone is missing. I asked her what that meant, and she told me a story about 2001, something about a ferry strike, something about a man whose body didn't come home, and how the angel cried until after Christmas. I'm not backing that up with an article. I didn't look. If I had, I would have told myself it proved something. The woman introduced herself as Señora Pineda, and for the rest of December we saw her every few days. She changed out wilted flowers, brushed dust from glass, said the same little prayers under her breath, and once in the shadow of the gallery, touched my sleeve and told me we should tell her if it got worse. She said it the way you say, call me if the fever climbs. What made it stop being an odd and mildly poetic maintenance problem was stupid. I took a sample. I don't know what I thought I was proving. Laya had a small travel kit with cotton swabs she used to dust lenses. I asked Rovira if he'd be offended, and he waved his hand like he wanted the whole thing to unexist. I climbed onto the ledge, balanced with one hand between two nameplates, and rubbed the swab gently under the angel's left eye. It came away damp. I sealed it in a bag like I'd seen people do in crime shows, and then I stood there with this tiny evidence of nothing and felt ridiculous. Back in the city, Laya knew someone at the university, Alba, who worked in a lab that did basic stuff for biology undergrads. She agreed to run a couple of non-invasive tests if we promised not to drag her into anything public. She rolled her eyes on the phone and said, "Don't say it's a miracle when it's obviously humidity." 2 days later, she called me into her office and showed me a printout on clean paper that smelled like toner and dust. It wasn't conclusive. It wasn't fancy. But she said the concentration of sodium chloride was consistent with human tears. Not just random salt spray. There were trace amounts of proteins like lysozyme and lactoferrin, which she said were normal components of tears. You can get similar profiles from sweat, she hedged, but the ratios are weird for sweat. She asked me if I'd touched it. I said I had. She told me to wear gloves next time if I wanted to keep indulging my superstition. I didn't tell Rovira about the lab paper. He already looked like a man being asked to babysit someone else's anxiety. He kept cleaning. Every morning the rag had that crusted corner. Every afternoon Laya swore the tracks were a little lower on the angel's face. He recorded the humidity with a little green device on a keychain. If you ever want to feel crazy, try to argue with a guy cheerfully reading 62% under eucalyptus trees and saying, "See? Normal." We tried to talk ourselves into reasonable explanations until the words felt like bubblegum. Stretched and losing flavor. One evening, Laya texted me that she'd gotten permission to shoot at dusk. When the city lights wash up the hill and you can see ships winking on the water, the guard, a big guy named Tony, said he'd walk us out 10 minutes after closing. We didn't mean to stay longer. We just did. It gets so quiet in there at night. The traffic on the ring road below is a soft hiss. The port cranes groan like animals. A dog barked once far away. Our breath made little clouds when we laughed. Laya had set her camera on a long exposure, and you know how that hypnotizes you. You just wait. We waited. The angel's face was pale and uncomplicated, blank like all blank faces are until you decide what they mean. There was a sound I still can't describe except to say it was the sound of someone beginning to cry. The intake, not the sob, just that breath before it. Laya froze. We both turned, expecting to see someone in the gallery behind us. The glass doors reflected us in a faraway square of orange light where the stairwell cut down. There was no one else. The air got colder in that specific spot, the way it gets cold when you open a freezer and lean in. I stepped forward stupidly and put my palm near the angel's face. It wasn't a temperature thing. The stone didn't feel like much of anything. But when I pulled my hand back, my skin was damp, and I swear it on whatever will make you believe me. There was no condensation on the ceiling, no line of drip above us, nothing like that. The dampness was localized to the angel's eyes as if the pores of the marble, if marble had pores, had offered up moisture exactly there. "Let's go," Laya said. She isn't dramatic, like I said. She didn't whisper or gasp. She said it like she was done with the shot. We walked to the stairwell. Our footsteps made too much noise. Somewhere below, someone dropped something metallic and it clanged up the shaft and then echoed in layers until it sounded like a lot of someone's. At the landing, we ran into Tony coming up with his flashlight, and he smiled that not quite smile of a man paid to not ask dumb questions. And we waved and promised we were leaving. That night I dreamed I had salt on my tongue and woke with my mouth dry. My phone vibrated at 3:12 a.m. It was a voice memo from Laya, short and ugly. "Don't go tomorrow." "Just don't," I'll explain. When I called, she didn't answer. I lay there listening to the bakery downstairs begin. Tray after tray thumping in that industrial way that means life goes on regardless of what you're afraid of. At 5, I gave up and walked to the kiosk on the corner for coffee. The owner, who always wore a ridiculous Santa hat the second it was acceptable, was watching the news without sound. The ticker crawled something about an accident on the ring road overnight. He tapped the glass with his knuckle when he saw me looking like I might ask, and shook his head in that slow way that means someone's morning has just been destroyed. I didn't go to the cemetery. I walked to the beach instead and sat on the cold sand with the other winter idiots and watched a gull steal a piece of bread. The sun did that Barcelona thing where it pretends it's generous but gives you no heat. At noon, Laya texted me, "Fine, come at 3. I met her on the hill, hands deep in my pockets. She didn't look like she'd slept. She said she'd gotten a call from Senora Pineda, who had whispered, "It's worse." When they say worse here, they say it with a long O like worse, and it makes it sound like a hole. Rovira had already been there that morning. The angel's face had fresh, faint tracks. Below her, the marble plates with names were meticulously arranged. 2 across, 6 down, each with a little oval for a photo. One plate a few rows down had a fresh strip of tape across it where the new inscription would go. This is normal. Families reserve spots. Names get added later. I'm telling you this because it's not the inscription that bothered me. It was the way the dried salt tracked down and then angled. Not randomly, but with too much intention. It spiraled. No, that's too romantic. It changed lanes like a raindrop that suddenly decides the best route is over your wrist bone. It stepped around old stains. It curved around a tiny chip. It landed squarely on the plate with the tape, leaving a translucent ring that, as the light shifted, looked bruised into the stone. It could be my brain writing an outline in hindsight, but I swear it looked like a mark made by a thumb pressed and turned. the way we used to twist a smudge off a page. The name under the tape hadn't been carved yet, obviously, but the last name was penciled faintly in the corner for the stonecutter. Laya saw it first. She got very still and gently touched my elbow. She knew that name. Everyone in her building knew that name. It was their neighbor, the bus driver who always carried his groceries up too many flights of stairs with too much cheerful swearing. The one who'd gotten a new hat for his granddaughter last week and made everyone in the stairwell critique the color. He'd had a heart attack on the ring road at 2 a.m. His wife had gone down in an elevator with 2 cops at 6. In small cities, and Barcelona is a small city when grief is walking around, you know those details in hours. Coincidence, I said, automatically and with my whole mouth like pushing a pillow over something. They reserved this niche. It makes sense his name is going here. The salt, I didn't finish. Laya didn't argue. She put away her camera. We didn't stop going. I wish we had. We told ourselves we were documenting it, which is the easiest excuse for looking at something that hurts. Senora Pineda started bringing us thermoses of broth, like we were the ones who needed watching. She talked about before, about how in some older section there's an angel with a chipped hand that's always wet in September. Rovira scolded her in the kinder way older men scold. Tony brought us a space heater once, then took it away when he remembered his boss would see the electricity use. The weather shifted, sunny one day, low mist the next. The crying was worst on clear, cold mornings when the light widened everything, and the city below was full of bright noises. Alba texted me asking if I had more samples, and I said no, because I decided this wasn't about proving anything. She sent me a picture anyway. A close-up of a sheet with columns and numbers and protein markers bracketed in pencil. I ran your first sample against a smear you left on my desk, she wrote, laughing emoji. And I actually felt relief at the joke. The ratios are weirdly similar, babe, she added. Tell me you didn't press that swab on your face first. I denied it, honestly. She said, then either the angel has human tears or you taste like stone. I didn't like the way she phrased it. I didn't like that I stared at my hands after, like I expected to see white dust in the creases. The last time we went up was December 21st, or the 22nd if you count after midnight as the next day. It was one of those evenings when the city felt thinner, like sound could pass through buildings. We got there late because Laya had been stuck at her place with neighbors and casseroles, and the kind of kindness that leaves you blurrier afterwards. The guard waved us in with a tired hand. 10 minutes, he said, but nobody in Spain means 10 minutes unless it's the train. The galleries glowed like an aquarium. Our footsteps were swallowed right away. For a minute I thought the angel was dry and felt a weird, childish relief, like when your fever breaks. Then I saw the tracks were simply finer, a delicate cross-hatching that caught light when we moved, like things under museum glass. I don't know how to tell this part slow. The sound again, that inward breath. Except this time it wasn't a sound in the space. It was in my throat. It was the body thinking the thought of crying before the brain has time to say, we don't do that. I put my fingers to my eyes and they were dry. Laya was looking at me with a carefulness that set me off, like her concern was a pin pulled from a grenade. Don't, she said, and I snapped back, I'm not. Except it sounded like someone else's voice, the one I use when I'm embarrassed. The angel's gaze didn't move. I know it didn't. But the weight of its face on the air changed. That's the best I can do. It's like when a crowd shifts and you know it without seeing anyone step. I took one of Laya's lens wipes, the sterile kind sealed in little foil squares, and without thinking I reached up not to the statue but to the nameplate below with the taped strip. I pressed the wipe to the place where the ring had been and held it there. I didn't know why. My hand left a wet print. Laya said my name once. The air got colder but not around me. Inside me, the way you feel a draft in your teeth. If you've never been chilled from the inside, I don't mean emotionally. I mean literally. It's a very strange sensation. We left in a hurry that didn't read as a hurry because we were too proud to run. Tony didn't look up from his phone at the gate. I don't remember the walk down or the bus ride back or how I got my key into the stubborn lock at my apartment. I do remember the quiet after I turned off my kitchen light. I remember the window being dark like a mirror. I remember walking to the sink and drinking water like I was trying to drown a taste. It didn't work. I could taste salt anyway, and it wasn't on my lips. It was in my nose. It was behind my eyes where tear ducts begin. In the morning, there was a text from Alba. If you don't want to bring me more samples, fine. But you left something at my lab. A photo followed of the foil square from the lens wipe, folded around the swab I'd given her. On it, she'd scribbled a date. The date was wrong by a day. She'd written the day we were there at dusk instead of the day I'd taken the first sample. That's the kind of detail your brain chews when it doesn't want the big bite. Then she called. She didn't sound scientific. "I'm not supposed to run personal tests," she said. And now her voice was the one people use in stairwells when they don't want to be heard. "But I did because you were freaking me out and I thought if it was sweat you'd stop. The profile from last night isn't like the first. It's closer. There's a marker I see sometimes in tear samples from people who work in hospitals, from chronic stress. I only know that because we did a project on nurses. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying it doesn't look like seawater and it doesn't look like a statue and it looks a lot like you. I said the things you'd say to me if the story were reversed. Contamination, sample mix-up, undergrads mislabeling something." She said she'd triple-checked, and then she said, "Please don't be angry," which told me her hands had been shaking when she pipetted whatever people pipette in those labs. I wasn't angry. I was tired in a way that made it hard to tell where the edges of my body were. I wish I could give you a big ending. I wish I could tell you the angel cracked like plaster or a voice came out of it in Latin. What happened is small. It's going to sound like nothing. On the 24th, Laia texted me a photo of the angel dry as paper. Rovera had put a ribbon on the railing with a little sprig of fake holly, and he was in the background of the shot, waving. The new name was carved and painted black. There was a glass door in front of it now with a photo clipped to the corner. The bus driver looking stern in a way that made your heart prickle because you knew he was actually soft. The glass had one fingerprint right in the middle, which I scolded myself for reading as a sign of anything. The fingerprint was probably a nephew trying not to cry. I started sleeping again. Sort of. The bakery resumed rattling me awake. The lottery guy wore a scarf with tiny bells on it because he said a team season was beyond saving, and you might as well jingle. I went to a party where the host made vermouths with slices of orange, and we all stood around and talked about the weird ear-shaped shadows the lights made on the wall. I put the lab paper in a drawer. I didn't go back to the cemetery. When I walked past the hill on my way to Montjuic for the fountains, I kept my eyes on the steps. Last week, back home, I woke up with my eyes crusted in that painful kid with a cold way. January dry air does that. I went to the bathroom and dabbed away the gunk with toilet paper dampened under the tap. The mirror had fogged a little from the shower my roommate took earlier. There was a ring on the glass at about the height of my face, where someone had wiped once and then let it dry, and around that ring the faintest white corona that looked like someone had sprayed salt water, and it had crystallized as it evaporated. I touched it with my knuckle and it flaked away, gentle. It tasted like salt. That's not evidence. Mirrors collect everything, but when I leaned in to look closer, I could see a tiny line of dried crystals that hadn't run down. It had run sideways. It had curved around a crack in the silvering just slightly, like it preferred one path over another. If you need me to say it clearly, I think some things cry because they're asked to bear more names than they were carved to hold. I think sometimes we bolt our grief to stone because stone is convenient, and the stone does what it can and maybe it learns from us. Or maybe we learn from it, or maybe I contaminated both samples and everything else is my stupid brain, knitting a sweater from one loose thread. That's why I'm writing this here and not in my notebook where I put the stories I lie to myself about. Haven't told Laia about the mirror yet because she moved on with her series and I don't want to drag her back into this. She's shooting bus stops now. The last time we had coffee, she mentioned she still walks up the hill sometimes and says hello to Rovira, who bought a new ladder. The angel, I asked? She shrugged like she didn't want to give me anything to chew on. Guapa, she said, pretty, dry. Then she looked at me the way she did in the gallery. You look tired, she added, and I told her it was the translation, which it is, sort of. You can exhaust yourself turning one language into another. You can also exhaust yourself trying to decide whether the crying you hear is yours. If you go up to Montjuic, don't tell me what you see. Don't send me a picture. If she's crying, I'd rather not know. If she's dry, I'll convince myself it was all humidity and suggestion and the kind of December that turns people inward. I keep thinking of Senora Pineda's word. Falta, missing, lacking, absent. Every time I taste salt now, even when it's just chips, I think of that word and it feels less like something is missing and more like something is choosing. I can't tell you what. I can only tell you that it keeps choosing the exact path it wants to take. Whether that's down a marble face or across a mirror or, on certain nights when the apartment is so quiet the pipes sound like breath, somewhere under my own eyes. I know exactly how this is going to sound, and I don't blame you if you roll your eyes. But I'm writing it anyway because I haven't really slept since May, and the only thing that helps is putting the pieces in order. I'm the one who did the night rounds at Glasnevin, the big cemetery on the north side of Dublin. I took the job because I like quiet places and because the dead don't ring you at 3 a.m. asking for overtime. That was the joke I used to make. My sister Sarsa said it was bad luck. My mate Fionn said it was perfect for me. Me being the kind of gobshite who finds silence comforting. If you've ever walked past the walls at night, you know it's not really quiet. There's traffic from Finglas, a hiss from the clouds even when it isn't raining, the occasional fox sneaking along the boundary like it pays council tax. But it's a steady kind of noise, and that's what I liked. My route started at the staff entrance by the museum bit and finished near the older sections where the famine plots are. I logged the tour times on a little clipboard and a phone app our supervisor Aidan swore he would learn to use one day. I had keys for gates that squealed no matter how much oil you gave them, and a torch that could pick out a name from 30 feet. I touched the cold iron railings to wake myself up, grin at the stone angels as if they were co-workers, and speak out loud now and then so I could hear a human voice. "All right, lads," I'd say to the statuary. "No parties tonight." The rituals kept me sane. It was the night after the last match of the season, so mid-May. The city had been loud, then quiet again in the way only Dublin does. Big cheers and then a blanket over it all. A damp breeze came in from the Liffey and turned to a clammy touch the deeper I went. I had a thermos of tea and a pocket radio tuned to some late program, where a man named Declan played old songs and told stories he didn't need to look up. When the ad breaks hit, I'd click the radio off so the cemetery's own sounds could press up against me. I never said it out loud, but I liked that feeling the way some people like the sea. I respect the place. People think security means running teenagers off and dealing with drunks. But most of it is checking fences and making sure the ground hasn't given in where the older graves are shallow. The famine years left long, communal plots under grass that looks like a football pitch if you don't know better. Underneath is another story. Boards that were bomb-proof back then are powder now, and occasionally the soil sags. We were trained to mark any dips with high-vis flags and ring the grounds crew. You learn the difference between a foxburrow and a dangerous settling by feel. I had just turned by the row of yews that makes a kind of narrow tunnel when I heard it. I didn't clock it as anything at first. It sounded like wind through a drain or somebody running water in a house just outside the walls. Then my brain decided it was singing. Not a song I knew, not English or Irish. I know bits of Irish, school leftovers, a few proper phrases I keep from my mother. This wasn't that. It wasn't Latin either, and I say that because I know what the old funeral psalms sound like. It came from the ground. Not deep, not far away, just under the path, as if all the stone were a thin lid and the sound were breath fogging the underside. I stopped because, of course, I did. The first thought I had was a practical one, a water main. We'd had a pipe go before, and the pressure made a howl that scared a different guard so badly he called the guards, the Gardaí, thinking it was an intruder. I crouched and put my hand on the tarmac. It was cold and humming. Humming is too tidy a word. It felt like a quiet throat clearing, and the vibration ticked along my bones. I told myself I might be catching a cold. I told myself lots of things. I walked on, slow, listening, the beam of my torch on the ground in case it was a fox or a human sleeping rough. The singing followed at a distance like the sound of a radio from a passing car. I tried to place the rhythm. Old hymns have a kind of square step to them. This one was rolling like the sea. I flicked my radio on and off to see if it was picking something up. The station wavered as if someone had put a hand over it. I got a burst of static, and Declan's voice cut into a sentence and then gone. Not unusual, I told myself. What with cloud cover and city interference? The trick of being alone at night is catching yourself when your brain starts coloring in monsters where the dark is only dark. At the far end of that path, the ground falls away a little into the famine sections. The grass dips like a gentle wave, and if you don't know, you wouldn't think it was anything but bad drainage. I had a high-vis flag in my belt because you always carry one when you get to that part. The singing, if that's what it was, got clearer. I could almost hear syllables. The impulse I had was the worst one. I took my phone out and started recording. It's nearly habit when you do this job. You send proof to Aiden that there was an issue, or you record yourself noting a time in case there's a complaint. The red dot came up on my screen and I felt stupid standing in the dark filming grass. It would be an embarrassingly ordinary video of nothing. My light picked up disturbed soil at the margin of one of the long plots. It wasn't a burrow. It wasn't wind scouring. It was a neat scallop in the turf, as if someone had pressed a thumb into bread dough and lifted it. My stomach did that little drop you get when you miss a step in the dark. I put the flag in a few feet from the edge. The singing did not stop, but it pulled away, into the ground, if that makes sense. You know the way a kettle goes from loud to quiet when you click it off? Except the heat is still in there and you can feel it if you get too near. It was like that. I backed up and turned off my torch. I don't know why I did that, except that lights sometimes make you feel safe when they shouldn't, like a child pulling a blanket on a burning bed. Without the torch, the night became a shape. Street light from outside limned the tops of stones. The clouds glowed the color of a city. And I heard it again, farther off toward the newer graves, as if it was moving beneath the paths, as if there were tunnels and it was taking those. We don't have tunnels, not like catacombs. There are drainage routes and crypts that are technically underground, and there's a little bridging under the older road, but not tunnels. That's what I told myself. The singing lowed, as if shaped by a curved space, and for a second I had the taste of copper in my mouth. I turned the torch back on so fast the beam jittered, and I half laughed just to hear myself. "All right," I said out loud. "Enough. I'm not dramatic. I did the practical things. Marked the spot on my map, made a note for morning, and finished the round. I didn't mention the singing to Aiden in the log because I wanted to have something less ridiculous than the ground hummed a bit. When I got back to the hut near the entrance, I listened to the recording. At first I heard only my breathing and the small click of my teeth. Then faintly there was a thread of sound under it. It wasn't the radio. I heard 7 or 8 notes that barely changed, but bent like someone resting their hand on the throat of the song. The words, if they were words, were rounded and had a hollow to them, sorry. This is the only way I can say it. The vowels didn't sit in my mouth right when I tried to imitate them. I sent the clip to Fionn, who is the kind of friend who listens and laughs after. "Is that you messing?" He wrote back. "Sounds like your da in the bath." Then after a pause, "Jesus, no, that's weird. Sounds old, not a song." He sent me a voice note doing a bad impression of a monk's choir and then a real message saying I should call someone. "Call who?" I said. "Plumber." He sent back a shrug emoji and a pint glass. When Aiden arrived at 6, I told him about the sagging bit of ground and left the rest. He rubbed his eyes and said, "We'll rope it off." The grounds crew came in at 9 and put up a little temporary barrier and a sign. I went home to my flat off Dorset Street and tried to sleep. I did that thing where you drift just enough to fall through, and then some part of your body jerks you up like you missed a step. My sister texted asking if I'd come on Sunday dinner. I said if I wasn't asleep I would. I reheated soup, scalded my tongue, and tried not to play the clip again. I failed. I put it in my ears on loop and told myself I was just a man who had caught wind in a pipe. The next night it rained. Real rain, not a mist. Water hit the stones like distant applause. It pooled in the low edges along the famine fields. I wore my heavier jacket and the rain rolled off my hood in a sheet that made the torch beam look like it was underwater. Everything smelled damp and clean in a way I always associate with summer starting. I walked my route a little quicker because the rain made the grass slick, and told myself not to stop even if I heard it. That's exactly when you hear it. It came up through the rain like a thread of warmth and cold. The notes were exactly as before. My heart learned the rhythm of it. It put itself inside the sound without my permission. There were fox prints along the path. My beam caught a pair of eyes and a red flank as one slunk away under a hedge. When I got to the flagged spot, I saw there were 2 more scallops in the turf near it. Not big, not like hands, no obvious prints. More like the ground had relaxed where the weight was and then lifted. I'm aware that reads like nonsense. The rain had smoothed what might have been marks into a uniform gloss. My radio crackled a few bars of some old ballad about leaving and returning and then fell silent. The singing went on, and beneath it I thought I heard something like another voice. Not harmony, a different line. I called Aiden. He didn't pick up because Aiden sleeps with his phone in the kitchen. I texted him and then I rang the non-emergency Garda station because even an idiot knows when he needs somebody else to stand next to him for a minute. A patrol car came brimming light into the small car park and a Garda I'd seen before. Murphy, heavy coat, kind eyes. got out with his partner. They were already wet. They had that half-smile cops wear when they turn up to find there is nothing to arrest and the only thing to do is be reassuring. "Evening," Murphy said. "What have we?" I pointed at the scallops and the flags and said the words lumped together in a way that made me sound more frightened than I wanted to. He crouched for a look, touched the turf with the back of his hand, then stood. "Not cats," he said unhelpfully. He tilted his head like he was listening to the rain. For a second I thought I saw him frown toward the ground as if hearing it too. And then his partner made a small noise and I told myself it was nothing. We made an incident note, they promised to swing by again, and I felt foolish and grateful at once. On the third night, the singing started before I'd even passed the first angel. This time it wasn't moving. It was under the famine plots, many voices, very faint, like a crowd outside a church 2 streets away. I say many and you'll think a choir, but it wasn't like that. Think of 100 people humming at slightly different timings and all of it resolving to one long sound. I walked out there slowly, the way you approach a stray dog you want to help and are terrified will bite. I swore at myself for recording it again and did it anyway. There was a light on near the museum. That's not unusual. Sometimes someone forgets. But it wasn't the cold white they use for the exhibits. It was yellow, warm, the exact light of a kitchen before dawn. It spilled a little and I thought of the caretaker's cottage that used to be there once and of cups of tea and the scrape of a chair. It made me want to go toward it and never go back to the dark. I stood with that thought, and the rain slowed and the singing lifted, as if hands had been taken off throats and breath had been let out. I went back the next morning to meet the grounds crew in Aden because the soil was worse. It wasn't collapsed, not in a catastrophic way, but there were disturbances along a diagonal line that matched stones dating to the famine years. I know those stones because I look at them every night. The names are worn smooth, but the dates are there if you angle your torch right. The crew fenced a wider area, and we talked about weather and subsidence and the history of pits filled quickly. A couple from Ballyman asked politely if they could walk around to reach a grave they wanted to tend. They were the kind of people who thank you for doing your job in the rain. I stood aside for them and felt ordinary again for 5 minutes. At home, I sent the clip to Sersa. You can trust a sister not to indulge you when you're being a child. She's a teacher and has a voice that can make an entire classroom nap. She sent back a long message I could hear her saying. It could be wind and culverts. It could be nothing. Please ring a plumber or the council before you ring a priest. Also, you sound tired. Come Sunday. Then 5 minutes later she wrote, "It doesn't sound like Irish. It doesn't sound like anything I know. It sounds like when Nana used to keen, do you remember?" "I do. Our grandmother had a way of singing to herself when she thought nobody could hear. A lost air that wasn't a song and wasn't not a song. On the 4th night, the singing stopped me completely like a hand to the chest. It was low as ever, but it came with a rhythm that was not quite a drum and not quite feet. That's the most I will commit to. Something down there was moving to it. The air was clear, no rain, and every sound carried. Somewhere off toward Phibbsboro, a siren wound up and down. My radio was just hiss. I stood where the ground slopes easy and thought about what was under me. Wood returning to earth, linen going to nothing, bones. I thought about the photograph in the Museum of the Pits. I thought about breath. There is a metal access plate near one of the older paths. It's not a tunnel. It's for drainage, that's what I told myself. But there's space down there for a person to crawl along in parts. I had the key because we sometimes have to clear leaves. My torch in one hand, the other on cold iron. I unsnapped the lock and lifted the plate. Warm air breathed up. I put my face over it without thinking, as if it were an oven, and smelled damp stone, a peat smell that doesn't belong in the city, and something like old cloth. The singing got clearer, as if I had put a glass to a wall. I should have shut it immediately and gone back to the hut and written it all down for Aden so the council could send proper people. I should have done that. What I did was kneel. I put my torch between my teeth and slid my shoulders into the mouth of the drain. Palms flat to take my weight. I told myself I'd go no further than the bend, just to see if there was a blockage. The stone was wet and the torchlight made everything near me look like a close-up on a cheap camera. I could see 1, 2, 3 meters ahead and then a curl where the channel turned. The singing became all presence. It wasn't louder. It was around. The only word I have is older. It was an old way of making sound that had nothing to do with microphones or a stadium or even a stone church. I reached the bend and found what I'd expected. Leaves, a bit of silt, nothing dramatic. My torch flickered. Not out. Just a pulse, as if something had passed between it and the air. The sound moved. It came from further along now, where I couldn't go without committing to crawling the length of a man in a hole that might close like a throat if the ground shifted. I pictured myself stuck there without room enough to draw breath. The back of my neck went hot. I reversed, palm sliding, and knocked my elbow hard enough to send a bolt of pain to my teeth. I backed out. I closed the plate. I locked it. I sat on the path and laughed until I was crying, because that's a thing people do when their bodies have been convinced they just survived something. I put in for a day off. Aiden raised an eyebrow but said nothing. We were quiet that week anyway. I went to dinner on Sunday with Saoirse and her husband Colm, and their little one, who is just learning to say truck and says it with a swear tucked in. When the chat turned to my night work, I started to tell a funny story about foxes and ended up telling everything. I didn't plan to. The lot of it fell out of me in order, like I'd been memorizing it. When I finished, Saoirse poured me more gravy as if I were a child who had arrived thin, and Colm said carefully, "There are older languages than Irish. There were people here before Irish people." He meant it well. "It could be, something in the rock. Sounds travel," he said. We both nodded like we were in church and someone had asked, "Do we take this bread and promise to be good?" The 5th night I went back on shift, the soil had been roped with more caution tape. The grounds crew had spaded around the edge of the sag and were waiting for a specialist to see whether it needed filling or just watching. The ground looked, it looked like someone had put their hands under and pressed up. Not a lot. Enough to turn the even plane into a soft rise that didn't belong there. The singing didn't start until well after 1. I'd done 3 circuits, making notes in the same careful hand I used in school exams, and I'd begun to think it wouldn't happen. Then it came like a kettle just off the boil. I felt the air tilt. There's a thing not many people know. Radios don't just go quiet. If you're in range of something, you'll catch a whisper, a carrier wave. If you're not, you'll get a kind of clean absence or you'll get static. My radio found voices that weren't on any station. None of it was words I understood. It wasn't the singing. It was like somebody testing a microphone in a room with terrible acoustics, the echoes folding into themselves. I lifted it and swear to God I spoke into it like a clown at a fair. "Who's there?" I said, because every bad film is in our blood. The radio made a sound that I can only describe as polite, like when something alive shifts in the next room and is careful not to hit a chair. I brought in another person the next night, because I needed to be wrong in company. Fionn volunteered. He showed up in an idiot hat and a grin and a backpack with 2 thermoses, 1 tea and 1 not tea. "Adventure," he said, and I meant to say no to the not tea, and then he poured me a little and it made a hot line in my chest. We did the round together. He made jokes at the angels. He did voices. For an hour, nothing. I started to feel worse, because the worst thing is being okay in front of someone and having that be temporary. Then the singing began under his steps. He stopped as if he'd been pinched. He looked at me with such honest surprise that some part of me unclenched. "You hear it," I said. "I hear it," he said. "Jesus Christ, it's like a—" He didn't finish. We stood together at the edge of the famine plots and the sound rose like steam. It wasn't mournful exactly. It wasn't happy. If a sound can be busy, this was that. Work being done, breath being held and released in a pattern that is older than speech. Fionn took out his phone, because that's what we do. The 2 of us made our stupid recordings like tourists in a church. "People under there?" he whispered, knowing he was being ridiculous. "People under there," I said, which was no answer. He walked the rope edge slowly, torches off, because we had learned that lights weren't help here. At one spot, he reached his hand out and then jerked it back as if he'd touched heat. "It's warm," he said. We both squatted and set our hands flat to the turf. It was slightly warmer than the air. So is a compost heap. So is a person. We didn't go near the access plate. We weren't heroic. We stood like fools and listened, and then we went back to the hut and drank tea that tasted like relief. Fionn's face was the color of bone china. He told me not to go in there again, as if I was the kind of man to crawl into drains for fun. We swore we wouldn't speak of it, because that's what you say when you absolutely will. He left at dawn with a promise to call me later, and a hug he pretended was an accident. In the morning, the disturbed patches had multiplied. Not everywhere, just here and there along the row as if something had walked below and the ground had breathed to accommodate it. The grounds crew swore softly. A woman from the council, in a bright coat, took pictures and said words like integrity and historic. An older man with hands like shovels looked at me and then at the ground in a way that said he had his own stories he'd never admit. We put up more signs that apologized to visitors, and we walked the edges to make sure nobody had taken the tape down. Aiden pulled me aside and said, "You're pale." I said, "Not sleeping." He said, "Don't be a hero." I said, "I'm not." That afternoon, Sarah's came by with a flask and a sandwich like a mum visiting a son on a building site. She looked out over the ropes and the flags and the neat grass and said, "It's a lot of people under there, isn't it? That's the thing about the famine. It's a word you learn before you learn what it means. All that loss pressed into earth as if a tablecloth could be smoothed over it." She stood very still and then she said, "Do you remember Nana's lullaby?" and hummed a string of notes that wasn't a melody, so much as a way to be in a room with a baby who didn't want to live there. The hairs on my arms lifted. "Don't," I said. She put the flask in my hand and told me to drink. I was the one who asked to do the night again, even though Aiden would have given it to somebody else. I wanted, this will sound mad, to be polite back. If there is something under the ground singing, I didn't want to leave it without a witness. The sky was clear and a cold star sat right between two clouds like the point of a needle. The city was quieter than usual for a Thursday. I walked my rounds, and when I reached the famine plots, I didn't step onto the grass. I stood at the rope and said out loud like a man at the edge of a garden, "I hear you." It felt less foolish to speak truth there than at my kitchen table. The singing did not pause or rise. It carried on like a tide that doesn't care about your declaration. Then somewhere deep another line joined, low and thready. I thought of it as a person who had been quiet now speaking up. Except there were no people. Not the way we say it. I did the unwise thing finally. I went to the access plate. I unlocked it. I didn't go down. I lay flat on the damp path with my ear over the opening like a child listening to the sea in a shell. The sound wrapped my head entire. The words were not words. The syllables curved around each other like strands of rope. My name is a simple one, Connor, and I nearly stood up and ran because I heard it. Not in the way of a human voice saying it, but in the way water finds a groove. The sound went over something like it, and I recognized it the way you recognize your own house in the dark by the way it takes your weight. I shut the plate. I relocked it. That morning, 3 new disturbed patches had appeared. They were at the feet of stones whose names I'd never really looked at. My torch beam always glancing away because the years on those stones were the same year carved again and again. I looked now. The names were unfamiliar. The dates were a row of winter. The ground was warm. On the main path, someone had chalked a little cross, probably a child visiting a family grave with a thoughtful parent. It felt like a good idea. I put the toe of my boot on the cross and then moved it so I wouldn't smudge it. That's as brave as I was. You can go to the museum bit and there's a recording you can put on your headphones of the history. It's voices. The narration is in English and Irish. The archival bits are rough, the way old recordings are. I stood there where I should have been doing a paper inventory and I listened to the wrong voices, the ones I had on my phone. I held both to my ears like a choice. I switched between them until I couldn't tell which was the world. A woman on the museum track said a sentence about the pits and the way they were filled, and my clip breathed over her, soft as a person through a door. I turned it all off. The silence after was shaped like what had been there. I gave notice a week later. Aiden didn't argue. He looked at me with something like relief. He hired 2 new lads, young, with the indestructible eyes of people who haven't lived long enough to be chewed. I told them where the foxes liked to cut corners and which locks were sticky no matter what oil you used and what to say to the angels, so they look after you. I didn't show them the plate. I didn't show them the clip. I told myself I was being kind. I moved to a daytime job in a building where the lights come on automatically, and the coffee machine sounds like a robot clearing its throat. I sleep sometimes. On the worst nights, I put the radio on low and leave it between stations so the hiss fills the flat like rain. I don't go near Glasnevin if I can help it. If I'm on the bus and it heads that direction, I get off early and walk. Fionn thinks that part is funny. Sawers does not. Last week, out of habit, I checked a local Facebook group for the cemetery to see if anyone had posted pictures of the summer flowers. A neighbor named Mrs. Kavanagh had taken a nice one of blue hydrangeas against old stone. The comments under it were the usual: beautiful, well done, God rest them. And then under a different photo someone had written, anyone else hear that singing late at night? Thought it was someone outside the wall, but my husband says it's the drains. There were 20 replies, half joking. One said, my granddad used to say the earth remembers. Another said, don't be daft. I put my phone down and told myself I would not pick it up and go to maps and find the exact place. I lost that argument. The new lads are careful, I'll give them that. They've kept the tape up and the flags renewed. The patches have settled a bit, then lifted in other places like the soft breathing of a sleeper turning over. The councilwoman came again. There's talk of putting up a new sign that adds more context, more words to make sense of the same earth. I walked past then because I could. I put my hand on the wall, the outside wall you've seen if you live here, and felt the chill of stone warmed by sun that had already gone. It felt like the side of a swimming pool when you're 10 and you've got your face turned to breathe. If you are expecting a moment where a hand comes up through the turf, or the ground gives way, or the radio speaks my name in a BBC accent, this isn't that. It was never that. The thing that happened is small, and I'm the only one who can put it in order, and I know that makes it suspect. But I promise you this. In my flat, in my building that pretends to be new even though the bricks remember a horse tram, the pipes knock sometimes at night when nobody has turned a tap. You know that sound, the sharp hollow rattle of metal expanding. It used to make me curse my landlord. Now it makes a line up my spine feel like a string. I lie still and count. 7 or 8 notes bent like somebody resting their fingers lightly. The way you can hush a throat without hurting it. It comes from the wall behind my bed, then from the radiator, then from the floor near the window as if it is moving along a route it knows and I don't. And yesterday, because I am a man who learns slowly, I went back to Glasnevin in the day and stood by a plot that has my family name on it. Not those famine fields, our people are elsewhere, but close enough that if you threw a stone wrong, it might land on that long grass. I looked down at the soil and thought it seemed newly brushed. The caretaker walked by and nodded. The air smelled like cut grass and warm stone. There were no voices, only the city. The hum we all pretend is silence. I put my fingertips on the top of the stone, not enough to make a show of it, just enough to say hello, and I swear the warmth there wasn't only sun. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe the earth holds heat in spots and wind whistles in the right key and a tired man hears an old language because he wants to. Maybe. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm writing this because I want it recorded somewhere that the ground under the famine plots lifted, and the singing started in May. And I am not the only one who heard it. If you walk there on a still night and you feel something in your bones, don't go down in the drains. Don't try to answer back. Stand very quiet and let the sound wash over your ears like a mother shushing a child. Go home, be kind to your pipes. And if you feel the earth under your bed, make the smallest motion, like someone turning on the other side of old linen. Don't be frightened. Or be frightened, if that's the thing that keeps you careful. I don't know which is wiser. I only know the song goes on whether we name it or not. And sometimes in the morning the soil is not exactly where you left it. I'm not the kind of person who posts on forums, but I need to put this somewhere that doesn't have my name attached. Somewhere it won't turn into gossip at work or a story my neighbors pass around when the elevator stalls. I work maintenance at Vienna's Central Friedhof. Not glamorous. Wet leaves, broken bulbs, locking and unlocking gates. Telling teenagers the cemetery isn't a park and that yes, the tram 71 drops them at the main entrance, not inside. I'm not superstitious. I am, however, very particular. I like things that open and close when they're supposed to. I like systems. If you ask the other maintenance staff about me, they'll say I'm the one who oils the hinges before they squeak and keeps the logbook neat. Which is why I'm the one who noticed the gate at the old eastern perimeter moving on its own at exactly noon. It started last winter, around the time when your breath hangs like a thought you haven't decided to say yet. Vienna gets that thin silver daylight in December, and the crows on the bare branches look like notes pinned to sheet music. I was assigned the far side of the grounds that week, the part most visitors don't see. People go to Zentrale Friedhof for Beethoven, Schubert, the big names, Tortue with the church and the long alleys. But beyond that, there are sections where marble gives way to iron crosses and then to sagging wood. And the paths shift from granite to dirt. And you find yourself walking until you meet the outer wall. The gate I'm talking about is not one the public uses. It's a wrought iron thing that had been chained and rusted shut since before my boss, Herr Leitner, started here. According to the old entries, they sealed it during the war, for reasons that made sense then and never got unsealed for reasons that made sense later. We call it the Schattentor, the Shadow Gate, partly as a joke and partly because it sits in the kind of permanent shade that makes you zip your jacket even on good days. I noticed it because the padlock looked shiny in a way it shouldn't. Not new, not polished, just touched. The way a water faucet looks after someone's used it and wiped it with their sleeve. I made a note. I checked the chain. It was secure. I tugged the bars because that's what I do, and they didn't budge. But when I did my rounds at noon, I heard a noise behind me, like a breath catching in a throat. I turned and the gate was a hair different. It's hard to explain. If you look at something 100 times, you start to learn its posture. The Schattentor had a slouch to it, a way the top scroll leaned left. That day, at exactly noon, my phone had just buzzed with the hour chime. The scroll leaned just a little less. As if it had taken a step, I told Lucas first. He's not maintenance. He's a friend who does IT for the city. We met because he helped us switch out the old camera system last spring, and he stuck around anyway. The man collects stories like other people collect magnets on their fridges. You have to show me, he said, which is what he always says. I told him to come by on Friday when I had the same route, and he did, with a coffee in each hand and a small backpack that rattled like dry bones. Motion sensors, he said. Don't look at me like that. You said a gate moved by itself. Let's see if it's just your romantic streak. I don't have a romantic streak. I like numbers and times. But I went along because it felt better to be the person who tells the story than the person who keeps it. We reached the gate at 11:50. The path there is always damp because the ground dips and the wall steals the sun. Even the air feels pinned down. Across the path is a patch of old graves, the names worn thin, the small stones set atop them by visitors who still remember. A groundskeeper I know, Renati, nodded as she raked and said, Schonentag, the way people do here. Polite, warm at the edges, eyes on her work. Lucas clipped a sensor to the gate post and set his phone to record. He's taller than me and has that narrow, focused look that makes you think of chess. He was chatty at first, then quiet as 11:59 became 11:59 and 40, 50:55. I've always liked the sound right before noon in Vienna. When you're in the city center, the bells layer on top of each other like laughter spilling down steps. Out at the cemetery edge, you get the 71's brakes squeaking, and if the wind is right, a howl that is only the ring road carrying a truck's complaint from far off. At exactly 12, my phone hummed and held the note for a second. In that second, the air in front of the gate changed. There's no other way to put it. It plucked. If sound had a texture, it would have been a string pulled tight. Lucas's sensor flashed. The chain on the gate tilted as if it had grown lighter. Then something happened that has been difficult to describe without people thinking I'm exaggerating. The gate didn't swing open the way a door opens when you pull it. It moved the way a person who has decided to leave moves. Already halfway gone when you realize it. An inch, then two. A sliver of the world on the other side slid into view, and it was the same as the world on our side. Brown grass, wall shadow, only flatter. I took a step and Lucas caught my sleeve the way you grab someone near a curb. Wait, we didn't see anyone. We didn't feel wind. What we saw was the chain hang wrong for exactly one breath, as if someone had unhooked it without their hands. The iron, which should have groaned like an old man trying to get out of bed, stayed silent. The gap widened to a hand's width. I remember clearly because my hand lifted and I measured it without meaning to. 5 fingers could fit. Then the gap closed. Not fast, not slow, like an elevator door that doesn't care if you're coming or going. The chain gave a little knock as it settled. The soft clack of metal on metal. Lucas exhaled. I realized I had been holding my breath because my chest hurt. Your camera, I said. He checked. The video showed us waiting, me shifting my weight, him flicking his eyes between the gate and the phone like a metronome. It showed the chain at the angle I know by heart. Then there was one frame, one single frame at 12, where the gate was open enough to slip a hand through. The next frame, it was closed. The software timestamp didn't skip. It registered the moment, but not the motion. Glitch? He said, though he didn't sound convinced. He scrubbed back and forth, and the same black rattle of pixels blinked open like an eye and shut again, making me think of a crowd blinking in unison. Tomorrow, he said, we do it again. I'll bring a different camera. I said I had to tell my boss. He said, tell him what? That a gate breathed? So I said nothing and told myself I would oil the hinges the next day. It felt like something practical to do, a way to reassert the rules. I oiled the hinges the next morning. The gate didn't accept it. That's what it felt like. The drop slid into the join and beaded like rain on a waxed coat. I wiped and tried again. The metal drank a little, reluctantly. At noon, I didn't plan to be there. I told myself I would be at Tor 3, talking with the florist about her delivery permit, but my feet took me back. Lucas was already waiting, his backpack heavier, his smile trying on bravado. 2 cameras, one from the city's traffic department. Don't ask how I got it. We waited. The air did the string thing again. The chain lightened. Lucas's mouth flattened into a bloodless line. "Don't touch it," he said, knowing I wasn't going to. We watched the opening open. The space on the other side looked thinner, as if the grass there would make less noise if you walked on it. I felt heat on my face even though it was a cold day. It was like standing near a bus right as it pulls up, that pocket of engine warmth. And very faintly I smelled the metal smell you get from old coins. Lucas leaned closer and said, "Do you see?" And then stopped. Not because of the gate, because of the quiet. We could both hear the city even at the edge of the cemetery. Distant breaks, a dog barked somewhere in the colony behind the wall, Renate's rake dragging leaves. And then all of that hushed, not disappeared, but stepped further away. I could still see Renate moving, but the sound of her rake lagged after her by a fraction. The gate closed. The world snapped back and I flinched like a rubber band popped my wrist. We checked the footage. Same thing. 1 frame with the gap. Only this time on the left edge, something else. You know how in winter you sometimes see people where you expect them. The priest from the small chapel, a couple with flowers, tourists with a map like a shield, and you register them without seeing them. The frame had that. It had the shapes of several people where there hadn't been any in the frames before or after. Pareidolia, Lucas said reflexively. But the shapes were right-sized and right-placed. Not the kind your brain makes from branches. One looked like a woman holding a handbag. One looked like a man with a hat tilted back, old-fashioned without trying. They stood too close to the gate from the other side, as if they knew it only opened a little. We went to Herr Leitner that afternoon. He's careful about how he speaks, slow, upright sentences like his posture. He didn't tell us we were being silly. He told us to check the cameras on the other side of the wall, which meant going around because that gate doesn't lead to another path. Just the perimeter and then beyond, the back of a driving school's lot and a tangle of bushes where the city stops pretending the boundary is tidy. The exterior camera faces the street side, not the cemetery, so it's not perfect. But at noon, on both days, the footage showed nothing and then showed, for the one frame, the shadows of several people stretched too long, like late afternoon shadows, even though it was noon. "A flaw," he said, but he rubbed his jaw as if it itched. That night, Lucas came over with the sensors and a cheap bottle of wine. We sat in my little kitchen, the one where the window looks down onto the courtyard and you can see who's recycling properly. My neighbor, an old gentleman named Jeremiah who feeds the pigeons despite the signs, knocked to complain that my hallway light bulb flickers now like a disco. I promised to fix it tomorrow. Lucas kept saying, "It's a mechanical problem made to look like an electrical one." Then, "No, that's not right." He has this habit of drawing boxes when he thinks. He drew a box around the word noon, then around the word open, then he connected them with a line and wrote why. He circled the empty space between. We tried to think of ordinary reasons. Thermal expansion, shift in the ground, vibration from the tram. I could get behind any of those. I wanted one of those because they're solid things you can put your weight on. We decided to test it again, but with more eyes. I called Eva, who works security out there. She's short and extremely practical. If you have a problem with a rowdy group near the gates at night, you want her voice on the radio. She listened without interrupting and said, "Fine, I'll be there. But if this is a joke and I stand in that cold spot for nothing, I will never bring you strudel again." The next day was brighter, the sort of January day that tricks you into going out without a hat. We met at the Schattentor at 11:45. Renate waved from across the path. 2 tourists drifted by looking for famous graves. I pointed them back toward the main alley and they went, each carrying a small bag from a bakery because people here know how to visit the dead with grace. Eva had a radio crackling on her shoulder. and the watchful face of someone who doesn't assume what she sees is what's there. "Okay," she said. We watch. We stand back. We do not put our fingers where fingers do not belong. The string plucked. I felt it in my throat that time, like wanting to swallow and forgetting how. The gate parted. The gap held. The air dipped, like you do when you step down off a curb without looking. Eva's eyes went sharp. "There," she pointed to the sliver. "There's—" She stopped. I was closest, and I'll tell you what I saw because I've written it down 100 times so I can see if I change it to make it easier on myself. I saw the suggestion of a shoe on the other side, just a toe, scuffed leather with a crease where a foot bends. I saw the hem of a coat that had been brushed against a dusty surface. I saw the edge of a handbag with a tiny metal clasp shaped like a leaf. The things you notice are stupid sometimes. That clasp is burned into me more than the idea of a person. My instinct was to move back. Lucas's instinct was to lean in. He is that way, always has been. He stepped closer than he had before and said softly, in German without thinking about it, "Entschuldigung," the way you say "excuse me" when you pass someone on a busy sidewalk. The gap did not get bigger. The chain did not lift, but the space on the other side changed. It was like the moment before an escalator arrives when all the steps are flat for a second, and then you see the teeth. The shadows pressed closer. I didn't see faces, only the sense of a crowd that had been waiting a long time and knew how to wait without making a fuss. The gate closed. The world popped, and Renate dropped her rake with the small clatter of reality resuming. We didn't talk for a few seconds because the noise of the city had returned like someone turned a dial back up. Then Eva said, "No one goes alone." It wasn't a rule before, but now it was. We made it a routine. Not official. We didn't write it down, and we didn't tell the papers. We did what people do here. We absorbed it into our days. At 11:55, one of us would drift to the gate. Sometimes two. Sometimes all three. We set up different cameras and got the same stuttering proof. The one frame. The long shadows. Nothing else. We tried microphones. They gave us 80 seconds of a tone that our ears didn't hear at the time. A hum like fluorescent light, except lower and more patient. And then one day, a Thursday, the city sent a small unit of police out. Not because of the gate, but because there had been some late-night break-ins along the cemetery road. 2 officers stood near Tor 11, stamping their feet and talking about lunch. I was at the Schattentor with Lucas and Eva. The sun was generous that day. The air didn't feel as pinned down. When the noon breath came, I almost thought we had imagined it before. Then the chain made that soft clack and we were back inside the ritual. This time something else changed. The gap held longer. Maybe 2 breaths instead of 1. Maybe 3. Lucas later would tell me it was 4 because he counted. I didn't. I was busy listening to my own heart like it was a radio losing its station. In the held open moment, a draft moved past us from the gate outward, not in. A smell came with it that I have tried to describe and make sound sane. Not rot, not flowers. It smelled like old paper that has been stored with wool. It smelled like a wardrobe door opening in a house that has waited too long for laughter. And it made me think of my grandmother's kitchen for no reason at all. "Do you want something?" Lucas asked very gently, as if he were speaking to a skittish dog. It's not the kind of question you plan to ask a gate. But it made sense in the frame of that moment because whatever was on the other side seemed close enough to want. I felt the crowd-likeness focus a little as if a decision were setting like glue. I took a step back and my heel bumped a stone. Eva reached for Lucas's jacket and didn't grab it. She just needed to know where he was in space. The chain twitched. The opening narrowed. And in that last blink of in-between, I thought I saw, no, I know I saw, someone lift their hand on the other side. Not a wave, not a threat. A small, ordinary gesture like you make when a bus driver closes the doors and you're a step away from making it on. I don't like that I'm writing this part, but it belongs here. 2 days later, Lucas didn't answer my call. He doesn't always. He has a cousin with a baby and will drop everything to go fix a Wi-Fi problem if you feed him pancakes. But by evening, he hadn't sent a single meme, and that's like him not breathing. I went by his place. His neighbor, a nurse who always has either night shift face or day shift face, said she had seen him leave around 11. He had a thermos. He looked like someone who had already bought a ticket in his head. I sprinted to the tram like a person in a cheap film and got off at the cemetery stop with my lungs full of winter. The Schattentor was exactly where it always is, in shadow, pretending it is just a piece of iron. Ava was already there, breath fogging. She had the tight mouth she wears when she's scared. He texted me, she said. He said, I want to try asking differently than nothing. We waited. Noon came. The string plucked, and my fear felt as obvious and simple as cold water down my back. The gate parted. The world leaned. Ava whispered, Lucas. It was a prayer and a warning both. Nothing happened. Or rather, exactly what always happened, and that was the worst part. The gap opened the size of his hand. It showed the thin world on the other side, the long shadows, the edge of a coat hem. It closed. The chain settled with its little clack, and our phones made that hum. We checked the footage with fingers that didn't seem to belong to us. One frame. The gate open. On the extreme left, a shape that could have been, if you know him well enough to know his shoulders. The suggestion of Lucas turned almost sideways as if he were trying to look back while stepping onto a bus. Could have been. Could have been anything. We told Leitner. He called the police. They took statements and were kind because, cemeteries can stick to people was how one of them phrased it. As if grief were static electricity. They made us feel like we were being dramatic, but not in a mean way. They canvassed and found nothing. The camera at the driving school lot offered its single glitch frame and no more. Lucas's apartment was orderly in the way it gets when he's planning something. Coffee mug in the sink, phone charger missing because it's in his bag, small note on the table with nothing important on it, don't forget keys. That later feels like a message. His backpack wasn't there. Days went stringy. Renat raked in her quiet orbit. Tourists came and took photos of snow-dusting famous names. Ava worked and did not bring me strudel. Leitner rotated the shifts so no one had the gate alone. I wrote the logbook entries as if correct labels could tether the world. At night, I would hear the hallway bulb wake and sleep and wake again. Jeremiah knocked once to say, now it is not a disco. Now it is a heartbeat. I replaced it anyway. A week later, I broke a promise to myself. I went to the gate at noon alone. It felt wrong, but everything felt wrong by then. People will ask why. People always ask why as if reasons behave. The only answer is that silence builds pressure. And the valve on the day I went happened to be me walking there with my collar up and my hands cold, and that smell of old paper caught in my throat. I stood close this time. Closer than Eva would have allowed. I could see my reflection faintly in the iron, warped, dimpled by the flaws in the metal, my face sliced by the bars into a person I wouldn't recognize in a crowd. The clock on my phone read 11:59, 56, 57, 58. There was a bird somewhere making the sound they make when they have found something good in a hedge. The tram squeaked in the way the 71 has squeaked since before I moved here. The air plucked. The light tipped. The gate parted, and the space on the other side did the thing that keeps me from sleeping properly. It looked inevitable. It looked like a place a step wants to be. I said, I want to give something back. My voice didn't sound like me. It sounded like the recorded version of a stranger in a museum audio guide. I don't know why I said it. I think I meant that I wanted to balance accounts, that the world had taken something and I needed to put something weighty on the other side of the scale so it would stop moving. In that gap, the crowd shape shifted, not forward, not back, just adjusted. The way people do when someone squeezes past them on a tram, a drifting of shoulders to make a new space. I lifted my hand and put my knuckles to the iron. The metal was warm, the kind of warmth that comes from a hand, not from sun. Someone touched the other side at the same place. It wasn't a dramatic palm slamming or a grip. It was the brief press of two knuckles against two knuckles with cold iron between. A small contact that in any other context would be forgettable. I can tell you that the person's skin felt dry, that their touch was firm but not insistent, that for the split second it lasted, I had the stupid thought that we were agreeing on something. The gate closed. My knuckles slid. The chain clacked. Everything snapped back with such precise obedience to normal that I almost laughed, and then I almost cried. And those two impulses circled each other and did nothing. I stood there until Renata called my name and said gently, "It is cold." Like that answered anything. I nodded and went to fix the way a stone had tipped in the thaw. That's the kind of work cemeteries ask of you. Straighten, sweep, replace, don't think too hard about the physics of a world that fills up and stays full. I wish I could tell you that Lucas came home. I wish I could tell you I've decided we were wrong about the shape on the camera. People like resolved stories. They want to point to a cause and then to an effect and then say the word closure like a key turning. I don't have that. I have the gate and the way it moves at noon, and the way some days the gap holds longer, and the way the air plucks, and the way that smell makes me think of wool and paper, and suddenly of the way my grandmother would tie an apron and hum under her breath, and I cannot tell you why. I changed my routes. I don't go there every day now. I let other people be the witness. Ava stands with them sometimes and makes rules that survive only until the air changes. Leitner has found a way to speak about it without mentioning it, so that no one asks for permission to film, and no one makes a TikTok that would draw a crowd we don't want. The police drive past sometimes and don't stop. Renata rakes. The tourists bring flowers, then take their pictures and their bread bags to the tram. Jaromir leaves seed in defiance of signs. The hallway bulb obeys me for now. The camera files are in a folder on Lucas's laptop that we can't unlock because of the password we never asked him for. And I try not to think about that because it was friendly privacy then and feels like a border now. When my phone vibrates at noon, I pause whatever I'm doing and look at the sky, even if I'm nowhere near the cemetery. It's not a ritual, it's a reaction. Today, for example, I was at the hardware store because we needed new spades. Noon came and I glanced at the ceiling lights. One flickered and then steadied. A woman next to me shifted her handbag, a brown leather one with a clasp shaped like a leaf. That's nothing. That's a common shape. That's me being suggestible. Later on the tram, a man stood near the door and leaned with his hat tipped back, and I don't know why my heart did that particular small gymnastics of fear and longing. These are not signs. They are city things. I don't know what happens on the far side of that gate. I don't think it's a hole into something dramatic. I think it's a habit the world has made. A crease in the fabric from folding too many times the same way. People wore a path there during a part of history when the city learned to shut doors and keep them shut. We've kept the habit. The habit has kept us. Sometimes it opens. Sometimes people who wait a long time learn how to wait without making a fuss. Sometimes those of us on this side decide we're the ones who should move to make room. These are not answers. They're the kind of thoughts you have when you count locks at night and arrange your keys by size. I did go back and press my hand there once more. I didn't tell anyone. I won't again. I made the same small contact. The knuckles found mine as if I were an appointment kept. It didn't make anything better. It didn't bring anything back. It didn't take me anywhere either. It only pinned me to the knowledge that there is a door that opens when it shouldn't, and that it is careful and ordinary about it. Like a person who checks their watch and stands up because the hour says so. I'm writing this now because I don't want to be the only person who knows the exact sound that chain makes, and because after I came home tonight and locked my own door, I set my keys in their tray and made tea and tried to read and failed and went to bed and lay there not sleeping. I know better than to dramatize. But at exactly midnight, the other 12, the latch on my bedroom window settled with a soft, neat tap. The way metal meets metal when it finds the groove it's lived in all its life. No draft, no wind, no nothing. Just that small, tidy sound of a thing closing on time. I got up, put my hand to the pane, and felt against the glass the faintest warmth from the other side, like a palm that had left a print and moved on. I stood there until the warmth went away and the city's night sounds stretched back to their usual distances. I don't know if I'm telling you this as a warning or just to empty my chest a little. If you visit Zentral Friedhof, go to the famous graves, bring flowers or not, be respectful, take the 71. Watch your step where the paths turn slick. You won't find the gate on a map, and we prefer it that way. Listen at noon if you think of it. It won't perform for you. It doesn't for us. It opens because opening is what it does. The way bells ring at the hour and old men feed pigeons contrary to signs and the city changes and stays the same. If you hear the little clack of a chain settling from far off, that's probably someone else's story. If you smell wool and paper, that's probably a shop you passed without noticing. And if for a second you feel someone touch your hand through something you can't see and didn't plan to reach for, don't pull away like it's hot, or lean in like it's home. Just notice the pressure, light and ordinary, and carry it with you long enough to understand that there are doors that belong to cities the way habits belong to people. They open at their own hour. They let through what they let through. Then they close quiet and polite as if they never moved. And later, when a latch somewhere in your apartment finds itself and taps, you will know the sound. And there will be nothing to do with that knowledge except listen.